Fairy Tales of Hans Christian Andersen. Hans Christian Andersen. Chapter 61. The Nightingale. In China, you know, the emperor is a Chinese, and all those about him are Chinamen also. The story I am going to tell you happened a great many years ago, so it is well to hear it now before it is forgotten. The emperor's palace was the most beautiful in the world. It was built entirely of porcelain, and very costly, but so delicate and brittle that whoever touched it was obliged to be careful. In the garden could be seen the most singular flowers, with pretty silver bells tied to them, which tinkled so that everyone who passed could not help noticing the flowers. Indeed, everything in the emperor's garden was remarkable, and it extended so far that the gardener himself did not know where it ended. Those who travelled beyond its limits knew that there was a noble forest, with lofty trees, sloping down to the deep blue sea, and the great ships sailed under the shadow of its branches. In one of these trees lived a nightingale, who sang so beautifully that even the poor fishermen, who had so many other things to do, would stop and listen. Sometimes, when they went at night to spread their nets, they would hear her sing, and say, "Oh, is not that beautiful?" But when they returned to their fishing, they forgot the bird until the next night. Then they would hear it again, and exclaim, "Oh, how beautiful is the nightingale's song!" Travelers from every country in the world came to the city of the emperor, which they admired very much, as well as the palace and gardens, but when they heard the nightingale, they all declared it to be the best of all. And the travelers, on their return home, related what they had seen, and learned men wrote books, containing descriptions of the town, the palace, and the gardens, but they did not forget the nightingale, which was really the greatest wonder. And those who could write poetry composed beautiful verses about the nightingale, who lived in a forest near the deep sea. The books travelled all over the world, and some of them came into the hands of the emperor, and he sat in his golden chair, and, as he read, he nodded his approval every moment, for it pleased him to find such a beautiful description of his city, his palace, and his gardens. But when he came to the words, "The nightingale is the most beautiful of all," he exclaimed, "What is this? I know nothing of any nightingale. Is there such a bird in my empire? And even in my garden? I have never heard of it. Something, it appears, may be learned from books." Then he called one of his lords-in-waiting, who was so high-bred, that when any in an inferior rank to himself spoke to him, or asked him a question, he would answer, "Pooh," which means nothing. "There is a very wonderful bird mentioned here, called a nightingale," said the emperor. "They say it is the best thing in my large kingdom. Why have I not been told of it?" "I have never heard the name," replied the cavalier. "She has not been presented at court. It is my pleasure that she shall appear this evening," said the emperor. "The whole world knows what I possess better than I do myself." "I have never heard of her," said the cavalier, "yet I will endeavor to find her." But where was the nightingale to be found? The nobleman went upstairs and down, through halls and passages, yet none of those whom he met had heard of the bird. So he returned to the emperor, and said that it must be a fable, invented by those who had written the book. "Your Imperial Majesty," said he, "cannot believe everything contained in books. Sometimes they are only fiction, or what is called the black art. But the book in which I have read this account," said the emperor, "was sent to me by the great and mighty Emperor of Japan, and therefore it cannot contain a falsehood. I will hear the nightingale. She must be here this evening. She has my highest favor, and if she does not come, the whole court shall be trampled upon after supper is ended." "Tsink!" cried the lord-in-waiting, and again he ran up and down stairs, through all the halls and corridors, and half the court ran with him, for they did not like the idea of being trampled upon. There was a great inquiry about this wonderful nightingale, whom all the world knew, but who was unknown to the court. At last they met with a poor little girl in the kitchen, who said, "Oh, yes, I know the nightingale quite well. Indeed, she can sing. Every evening I have permission to take home to my poor sick mother the scraps from the table. She lives down by the seashore, and as I come back I feel tired, and I sit down in the wood to rest, and listen to the nightingale's song. Then the tears come into my eyes, and it is just as if my mother kissed me." "Little maiden," said the lord-in-waiting, "I will obtain for you constant employment in the kitchen, and you shall have permission to see the emperor dine, if you will lead us to the nightingale, for she is invited for this evening to the palace." So she went into the wood where the nightingale sang, and half the court followed her. As they went along, a cow began lowing. "Oh," said a young courtier, "now we have found her. What wonderful power for such a small creature. I have certainly heard it before." "No, that is only a cow lowing," said the little girl. "We are a long way from the place yet." Then some frogs began to croak in the marsh. "Beautiful," said the young courtier again. "Now I hear it, tinkling like little church bells." "No, those are frogs," said the little maiden. but I think we shall soon hear her now." And presently the nightingale began to sing, "Hark, hark! There she is," said the girl, "and there she sits," she added, pointing to a little grey bird who was perched on a bough. "Is it possible?" said the lord-in-waiting. "I never imagined it would be a little, plain, simple thing like that. She has certainly changed color at seeing so many grand people around her." "Little nightingale," cried the girl, raising her voice, "our most gracious emperor wishes you to sing before him." "With the greatest pleasure," said the nightingale, and began to sing most delightfully. "It sounds like tiny glass bells," said the lord-in-waiting, "and see how her little throat works. It is surprising that we have never heard this before. She will be a great success at court." "Shall I sing once more before the emperor?" asked the nightingale, who thought he was present. "My excellent little nightingale," said the courtier, "I have the great pleasure of inviting you to a court festival this evening, where you will gain imperial favor by your charming song." "My song sounds best in the greenwood," said the bird, but still she came willingly when she heard the emperor's wish. The palace was elegantly decorated for the occasion. The walls and floors of porcelain glittered in the light of 1,000 lamps. Beautiful flowers, round which little bells were tied, stood in the corridors. What with the running to and fro and the draught, these bells tinkled so loudly that no one could speak to be heard. In the center of the great hall, a golden perch had been fixed for the nightingale to sit on. The whole court was present, and the little kitchen maid had received permission to stand by the door. She was not installed as a real court cook. All were in full dress, and every eye was turned to the little grey bird when the emperor nodded to her to begin. The nightingale sang so sweetly that the tears came into the emperor's eyes, and then rolled down his cheeks, as her song became still more touching and went to everyone's heart. The emperor was so delighted that he declared the nightingale should have his gold slipper to wear round her neck, but she declined the honor with thanks. She had been sufficiently rewarded already. "I have seen tears in an emperor's eyes," she said, "that is my richest reward. An emperor's tears have wonderful power, and are quite sufficient honor for me." And then she sang again more enchantingly than ever. "That singing is a lovely gift," said the ladies of the court to each other, and then they took water in their mouths to make them utter the gurgling sounds of the nightingale when they spoke to anyone, so that they might fancy themselves nightingales. And the footmen and chambermaids also expressed their satisfaction, which is saying a great deal, for they are very difficult to please. In fact, the nightingale's visit was most successful. She was now to remain at court, to have her own cage, with liberty to go out twice a day, and once during the night. 12 servants were appointed to attend her on these occasions, who each held her by a silken string fastened to her leg. There was certainly not much pleasure in this kind of flying. The whole city spoke of the wonderful bird, and when two people met, one said nightin, and the other said gale, and they understood what was meant, for nothing else was talked of. 11 peddlers' children were named after her, but not of them could sing a note. One day the emperor received a large packet on which was written "The Nightingale." "Here is no doubt a new book about our celebrated bird," said the emperor. But instead of a book, it was a work of art contained in a casket, an artificial nightingale made to look like a living one, and covered all over with diamonds, rubies, and sapphires. As soon as the artificial bird was wound up, it could sing like the real one, and could move its tail up and down, which sparkled with silver and gold. Round its neck hung a piece of ribbon, on which was written "The Emperor of China's nightingale is poor compared with that of the Emperor of Japan's." "This is very beautiful," exclaimed all who saw it, and he who had brought the artificial bird received the title of Imperial Nightingale Bringer-in-Chief. "Now they must sing together," said the court, "and what a duet it will be." But they did not get on well, for the real nightingale sang in its own natural way, but the artificial bird sang only waltzes. "That is not a fault," said the music master, "it is quite perfect to my taste." So then it had to sing alone, and was as successful as the real bird. Besides, it was so much prettier to look at, for it sparkled like bracelets and breastpins. 33 times did it sing the same tunes without being tired. The people would gladly have heard it again, but the emperor said the living nightingale ought to sing something. But where was she? No one had noticed her when she flew out at the open window, back to her own green woods. "What strange conduct," said the emperor, when her flight had been discovered, and all the courtiers blamed her, and said she was a very ungrateful creature. "But we have the best bird after all," said one, and then they would have the bird sing again, although it was the 34th time they had listened to the same piece, and even then they had not learnt it, for it was rather difficult. But the music master praised the bird in the highest degree, and even asserted that it was better than a real nightingale, not only in its dress and the beautiful diamonds, but also in its musical power. "For you must perceive, my chief lord and emperor," that with a real nightingale we can never tell what is going to be sung, but with this bird everything is settled. It can be opened and explained, so that people may understand how the waltzes are formed, and why one note follows upon another. This is exactly what we think, they all replied, and then the music master received permission to exhibit the bird to the people on the following Sunday, and the emperor commanded that they should be present to hear it sing. When they heard it they were like people intoxicated, however it must have been with drinking tea, which is quite a Chinese custom. They all said oh, and held up their forefingers and nodded, but a poor fisherman, who had heard the real nightingale, said, "It sounds prettily enough, and the melodies are all alike, yet there seems something wanting, I cannot exactly tell what." And after this the real nightingale was banished from the empire, and the artificial bird placed on a silk cushion close to the emperor's bed. The presents of gold and precious stones which had been received with it were round the bird, and it was now advanced to the title of Little Imperial Toilet Singer, and to the rank of number 1 on the left hand, for the emperor considered the left side, on which the heart lies, as the most noble, and the heart of an emperor is in the same place as that of other people. The music master wrote a work, in 25 volumes, about the artificial bird, which was very learned and very long, and full of the most difficult Chinese words, yet all the people said they had read it, and understood it, for fear of being thought stupid and having their bodies trampled upon. So a year passed, and the emperor, the court, and all the other Chinese knew every little turn in the artificial bird's song, and for that same reason it pleased them better. They could sing with the bird, which they often did. The street boys sang, ziz cluck, 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 and the emperor himself could sing it also. It was really most amusing. One evening, when the artificial bird was singing its best, and the emperor lay in bed listening to it, something inside the bird sounded whiz. Then a spring cracked. Whir-rah-rah-rah went all the wheels, running round, and then the music stopped. The emperor immediately sprang out of bed, and called for his physician, but what could he do? Then they sent for a watchmaker, and, after a great deal of talking and examination, the bird was put into something like order, but he said that it must be used very carefully, as the barrels were worn, and it would be impossible to put in new ones without injuring the music. Now there was great sorrow, as the bird could only be allowed to play once a year, and even that was dangerous for the works inside it. Then the music master made a little speech, full of hard words, and declared that the bird was as good as ever, and, of course no one contradicted him. 5 years passed, and then a real grief came upon the land. The Chinese really were fond of their emperor, and he now lay so ill that he was not expected to live. Already a new emperor had been chosen, and the people who stood in the street asked the lord-in-waiting how the old emperor was, but he only said, "Pooh," and shook his head. Cold and pale lay the emperor in his royal bed, the whole court thought he was dead, and everyone ran away to pay homage to his successor. The chamberlains went out to have a talk on the matter, and the ladies' maids invited company to take coffee. Cloth had been laid down on the halls and passages, so that not a footstep should be heard, and all was silent and still. But the emperor was not yet dead, although he lay white and stiff on his gorgeous bed, with the long velvet curtains and heavy gold tassels. A window stood open, and the moon shone in upon the emperor and the artificial bird. The poor emperor, finding he could scarcely breathe with a strange weight on his chest, opened his eyes, and saw death sitting there. He had put on the emperor's golden crown, and held in one hand his sword of state, and in the other his beautiful banner. All around the bed and peeping through the long velvet curtains, were a number of strange heads, some very ugly, and others lovely and gentle-looking. These were the emperor's good and bad deeds, which stared him in the face. Now death sat at his heart. "Do you remember this? Do you recollect that?" they asked one after another, thus bringing to his remembrance circumstances that made the perspiration stand on his brow. "I know nothing about it," said the emperor. "Music! Music!" he cried, "the large Chinese drum. That I may not hear what they say." But they still went on, and death nodded like a Chinaman to all they said. "Music! Music!" shouted the emperor. "You little precious golden bird, sing, pray sing. I have given you gold and costly presents, I have even hung my golden slip around your neck. Sing, sing." But the bird remained silent. There was no one to wind it up, and therefore it could not sing a note. Death continued to stare at the emperor with his cold, hollow eyes, and the room was fearfully still. Suddenly there came through the open window the sound of sweet music. Outside, on the bough of a tree, sat the living nightingale. She had heard of the emperor's illness, and was therefore come to sing to him of hope and trust. And as she sung, the shadows grew paler and paler, the blood in the emperor's veins flowed more rapidly, and gave life to his weak limbs, and even Death himself listened, and said, "Go on, little nightingale, go on. Then will you give me the beautiful golden sword and that rich banner? And will you give me the emperor's crown?" Said the bird. So Death gave up each of these treasures for a song, and the nightingale continued her singing. She sung of the quiet churchyard, where the white roses grow, where the elder tree wafts its perfume on the breeze, and the fresh, sweet grass is moistened by the mourner's tears. Then Death longed to go and see his garden, and floated out through the window in the form of a cold, white mist. "Thanks, thanks, you heavenly little bird. I know you well. I banished you from my kingdom once, and yet you have charmed away the evil faces from my bed, and banished death from my heart, with your sweet song. How can I reward you?" "You have already rewarded me," said the nightingale. "I shall never forget that I drew tears from your eyes the first time I sang to you. These are the jewels that rejoice a singer's heart. But now sleep, and grow strong and well again. I will sing to you again." And as she sung, the emperor fell into a sweet sleep. And how mild and refreshing that slumber was! When he awoke, strengthened and restored, the sun shone brightly through the window, but not one of his servants had returned. They all believed he was dead. Only the nightingale still sat beside him, and sang. "You must always remain with me," said the emperor. "You shall sing only when it pleases you, and I will break the artificial bird into 1,000 pieces." "No, do not do that," replied the nightingale. "The bird did very well as long as it could. Keep it here still. I cannot live in the palace, and build my nest, but let me come when I like. I will sit on a bough outside your window, in the evening, and sing to you, so that you may be happy, and have thoughts full of joy. I will sing to you of those who are happy, and those who suffer, of the good and the evil, who are hidden around you. The little singing bird flies far from you and your court to the home of the fisherman and the peasant's cot. I love your heart better than your crown, and yet something holy lingers round that also. I will come, I will sing to you, but you must promise me one thing." "Everything," said the emperor, who, having dressed himself in his imperial robes, stood with the hand that held the heavy golden sword pressed to his heart. "I only ask one thing," she replied. "Let no one know that you have a little bird who tells you everything. It will be best to conceal it." So saying, the nightingale flew away. The servants now came in to look after the dead emperor, when, lo! there he stood, and, to their astonishment, said, "Good morning." Chapter 62. There is no doubt about it. That it was a terrible affair, said a hen, and in a quarter of the town, too, where it had not taken place. That it was a terrible affair in a hen roost. I cannot sleep alone tonight. It is a good thing that many of us sit on the roost together. And then she told a story that made the feathers on the other hens bristle up, and the cock's comb fall. There was no doubt about it. But we will begin at the beginning, and that is to be found in a hen roost in another part of the town. The sun was setting, and the fowls were flying on to their roost. One hen, with white feathers and short legs, used to lay her eggs according to the regulations, and was, as a hen, respectable in every way. As she was flying upon the roost, she plucked herself with her beak, and a little feather came out. "There it goes," she said, "the more I pluck, the more beautiful do I get." She said this merrily, for she was the best of the hens, and, moreover, as had been said, very respectable. With that she went to sleep. It was dark all around, and hen sat close to hen. But the one who sat nearest to her merry neighbor did not sleep. She had heard and yet not heard, as we are often obliged to do in this world, in order to live at peace, but she could not keep it from her neighbor on the other side any longer. "Did you hear what was said? I mention no names, but there is a hen here who intends to pluck herself in order to look well. If I were a cock, I should despise her." Just over the fowls sat the owl, with Father Owl and the little owls. The family has sharp ears, and they all heard every word that their neighbor had said. They rolled their eyes, and Mother Owl, beating her wings, said, "Don't listen to her." "But I suppose you heard what was said?" "I heard it with my own ears, and one has to hear a great deal before they fall off. There is one among the fowls who has so far forgotten what is becoming to a hen that she plucks out all her feathers and lets the cock see it. Prenez garde aux enfants," said Father Owl. "Children should not hear such things. But I must tell our neighbor Owl about it, she is such an estimable owl to talk to." And with that she flew away. "Too-woo! Too-woo!" They both hooted into the neighbor's dovecot to the doves inside. "Have you heard? Have you heard? Too-woo! There is a hen who has plucked out all her feathers for the sake of the cock. She will freeze to death, if she is not frozen already." "Too-woo! Where? Where?" cooed the doves. "In the neighbor's yard. I have as good as seen it myself." It is almost unbecoming to tell the story, but there is no doubt about it. Believe every word of what we tell you, said the doves, and cooed down into their poultry yard. There is a hen near. Some say that there are two who have plucked out all their feathers, in order not to look like the others, and to attract the attention of the cock. It is a dangerous game, for one can easily catch cold and die from fever, and both of these are dead already. Wake up! Wake up! Crowed the cock, and flew upon his board. Sleep was still in his eyes, but yet he crowed out, 3 hens have died of their unfortunate love for a cock. They had plucked out all their feathers. It is a horrible story, I will not keep it to myself, but let it go farther, let it go farther, shrieked the bats, and the hens clucked and the cocks crowed, let it go farther. Let it go farther. In this way the story travelled from poultry yard to poultry yard, and at last came back to the place from which it had really started. 5 hens, it now ran, had plucked out all their feathers to show which of them had grown leanest for love of the cock, and then they all pecked at each other till the blood ran down and they fell down dead, to the derision and shame of their family, and to the great loss of their owner. The hen who had lost the loose little feather naturally did not recognize her own story, and being a respectable hen, said, I despise those fowls, but there are more of that kind. Such things ought not to be concealed, and I will do my best to get the story into the papers, so that it becomes known throughout the land. The hens have richly deserved it, and their family too. It got into the papers, it was printed, and there is no doubt about it, one little feather may easily grow into 5 hens. Chapter 63. In the nursery, father, and mother, and brothers, and sisters, were gone to the play. Only little Anna and her grandpapa were left at home. We'll have a play too, he said, and it may begin immediately. But we have no theatre, cried little Anna, and we have no one to act for us. My old doll cannot, for she is a fright, and my new one cannot, for she must not trample her new clothes. One can always get actors if one makes use of what one has, observed grandpapa. Now we'll go into the theatre. Here we will put up a book, there another, and there a third, in a sloping row. Now 3 on the other side. So, now we have the side scenes. The old box that lies yonder may be the back stairs, and we'll lay the flooring on top of it. The stage represents a room, as everyone may see. Now we want the actors. Let us see what we can find in the plaything box. First the personages, and then we will get the play ready. One after the other, that will be capital. Here's a pipe head, and yonder an odd glove, they will do very well for father and daughter. But those are only 2 characters, said little Anna. Here's my brother's old waistcoat, could not that play in our piece, too? It's big enough, certainly, replied grandpapa. It shall be the lover. There's nothing in the pockets, and that's very interesting, for that's half of an unfortunate attachment. And here we have the nutcracker's boots, with spurs to them. Row, dow, dow. How they can stamp and strut. They shall represent the unwelcome wooer, whom the lady does not like. What kind of a play will you have now? Shall it be a tragedy, or a domestic drama? A domestic drama, please, said little Anna, for the others are so fond of that. Do you know one? I know 100, said grandpapa. Those that are most in favor are from the French, but they are not good for little girls. In the meantime, we may take one of the prettiest, for inside they're all very much alike. Now I shake the pen. Cockalorum. So now, here's the play. Brand span new. Now listen to the playbill. And grandpapa took a newspaper, and read as if he were reading from it. The Pipehead and the Good Head, a family drama in 1 act. Characters, Mr. Pipehead, a father. Mr. Waistcoat, a lover. Miss Glove, a daughter. Mr. De Boots, a suitor. And now we're going to begin. The curtain rises. We have no curtain, so it has risen already. All the characters are there, and so we have them at hand. Now I speak as Papa Pipehead. He's angry today. One can see that he's a colored meerschaum, snick, snake, snur, bassler. I'm master of this house. I'm the father of my daughter. Will you hear what I have to say? Mr. De Boots is a person in whom one may see one's face, his upper part is of Morocco, and he has spurs into the bargain. Snick, snake, snake. He shall have my daughter. Now listen to what the waistcoat says, little Anna, said grandpapa. Now the waistcoat's speaking. The waistcoat has a lay-down collar, and is very modest, but he knows his own value, and has quite a right to say what he says. I haven't a spot on me. Goodness of material ought to be appreciated. I am of real silk, and have strings to me. Apostrophe on the wedding day, but no longer. You don't keep your color in the Washington. This is Mr. Pipehead who is speaking. Mr. De Boots is watertight, of strong leather, and yet very delicate. He can creak, and clank with his spurs, and has an Italian physiognomy. But they ought to speak in verses, said Anna, for I've heard that's the most charming way of all. They can do that too, replied Grandpapa, and if the public demands it, they will talk in that way. Just look at little Miss Glove, how she's pointing her fingers. Could I but have my love, who then so happy as Glove, ah, if I from him must part, I'm sure it will break my heart, bah. The last word was spoken by Mr. Pipehead, and now it's Mr. Waistcoat's turn. Oh Glove, my own dear, though it cost me a tear, thou must be mine, for Holger Danske has sworn it. Mr. de Boots, hearing this, kicks up, jingles his spurs, and knocks down 3 of the side scenes. That's exceedingly charming, cried little Anna. Silence. Silence, said Grandpapa. Silent approbation will show that you are the educated public in the stalls. Now Miss Glove sings her great song with startling effects. I can't see, hi-ho, and therefore I'll crow, kikariki, in the lofty hall. Now comes the exciting part, little Anna. This is the most important in all the play. Mr. Waistcoat undoes himself, and addresses his speech to you, that you may applaud, but leave it alone, that's considered more genteel. I am driven to extremities. Take care of yourself. Now comes the plot. You are the Pipehead, and I am the good head Snap. There you go. Do you notice this, little Anna? Asked Grandpapa. That's a most charming comedy. Mr. Waistcoat seized the old Pipehead and put him in his pocket. There he lies, and the Waistcoat says, you are in my pocket, you can't come out till you promise to unite me to your daughter Glove on the left. I hold out my right hand. That's awfully pretty, said little Anna, and now the old Pipehead replies, though I'm all ear, very stupid I appear. Where's my humour? Gone, I fear. And I feel my hollow sticks not here. Ah! Never, my dear. Did I feel so queer? Oh! Pray let me out. And like a lamb led to slaughter, I'll betroth you, no doubt. To my daughter? Is the play over already? Asked little Anna. By no means, replied Grandpapa. It's only all over with Mr. de Boots. Now the lovers kneel down, and one of them sings, Father. And the other, come, do as you ought to do, bless your son and daughter, and they receive his blessing, and celebrate their wedding, and all the pieces of furniture sing in chorus. Clink. Clanks, 1,000 thanks. And now the play is over, and now we'll applaud, said Grandpapa. We'll call them all out, and the pieces of furniture too, for they are of mahogany. And is not our play just as good as those which the others have in the real theatre? Our play is much better, said Grandpapa. It is shorter, the performers are natural, and it has passed away the interval before tea time. Chapter 64 The Old Bachelor's Nightcap. There is a street in Copenhagen with a very strange name. It is called Hisken Street. Where the name came from, and what it means is very uncertain. It is said to be German, but that is unjust to the Germans, for it would then be called Hausken, not Hisken. Hausken means a little house, and for many years it consisted only of a few small houses, which were scarcely larger than the wooden booths we see in the marketplaces at fair time. They were perhaps a little higher, and had windows, but the panes consisted of horn or bladder skins, for glass was then too dear to have glazed windows in every house. This was a long time ago, so long indeed that our grandfathers, and even great-grandfathers, would speak of those days as olden times. Indeed, many centuries have passed since then. The rich merchants in Bremen and Lübeck, who carried on trade in Copenhagen, did not reside in the town themselves, but sent their clerks, who dwelt in the wooden booths in the Hausken Street, and sold beer and spices. The German beer was very good, and there were many sorts from Bremen, Prussia, and Brunswick, and quantities of all sorts of spices, saffron, aniseed, ginger, and especially pepper. Indeed, pepper was almost the chief article sold here, so it happened at last that the German clerks in Denmark got their nickname of pepper gentry. It had been made a condition with these clerks that they should not marry, so that those who lived to be old had to take care of themselves, to attend to their own comforts, and even to light their own fires, when they had any to light. Many of them were very aged, lonely old boys, with strange thoughts and eccentric habits. From this, all unmarried men, who have attained a certain age, are called, in Denmark, pepper gentry, and this must be remembered by all those who wish to understand the story. These pepper gentlemen, or, as they are called in England, old bachelors, are often made a butt of ridicule. They are told to put on their nightcaps, draw them over their eyes, and go to sleep. The boys in Denmark make a song of it, thus: Poor old bachelor, cut your wood. Such a nightcap was never seen. Who would think it was ever clean? Go to sleep, it will do you good. So they sing about the pepper gentleman, so do they make sport of the poor old bachelor and his nightcap, and all because they really know nothing of either. It is a cap that no one need wish for, or laugh at. And why not? Well, we shall hear in the story. In olden times, Housken Street was not paved, and passengers would stumble out of one hole into another, as they generally do in unfrequented highways, and the street was so narrow, and the booths leaning against each other were so close together, that in the summer time a sail would be stretched across the street from one booth to another opposite. At these times the odor of the pepper, saffron, and ginger became more powerful than ever. Behind the counter, as a rule, there were no young men. The clerks were almost all old boys, but they did not dress as we are accustomed to see old men represented, wearing wigs, nightcaps, and knee breeches, and with coat and waistcoat buttoned up to the chin. We have seen the portraits of our great-grandfathers dressed in this way, but the pepper gentlemen had no money to spare to have their portraits taken, though one of them would have made a very interesting picture for us now, if taken as he appeared standing behind his counter, or going to church, or on holidays. On these occasions, they wore high-crowned, broad-brimmed hats, and sometimes a younger clerk would stick a feather in his. The woolen shirt was concealed by a broad, linen collar, the close jacket was buttoned up to the chin, and the cloak hung loosely over it. The trousers were tucked into the broad, tipped shoes, for the clerks wore no stockings. They generally stuck a table knife and spoon in their girdles, as well as a larger knife, as a protection to themselves, and such a weapon was often very necessary. After this fashion was Antony dressed on holidays and festivals, excepting that, instead of a high-crowned hat, he wore a kind of bonnet, and under it a knitted cap, a regular nightcap, to which he was so accustomed that it was always on his head. He had two nightcaps, I mean, not heads. Antony was one of the oldest of the clerks, and just the subject for a painter. He was as thin as a lath, wrinkled round the mouth and eyes, had long, bony fingers, bushy, grey eyebrows, and over his left eye hung a thick tuft of hair, which did not look handsome, but made his appearance very remarkable. People knew that he came from Bremen. It was not exactly his home, although his master resided there. His ancestors were from Thuringia, and had lived in the town of Eisenach, close by Wartburg. Old Antony seldom spoke of this place, but he thought of it all the more. The old clerks of Housken Street very seldom met together. Each one remained in his own booth, which was closed early enough in the evening, and then it looked dark and dismal out in the street. Only a faint glimmer of light struggled through the horn panes in the little window on the roof, while within sat the old clerk, generally on his bed, singing his evening hymn in a low voice, or he would be moving about in his booth till late in the night, busily employed in many things. It certainly was not a very lively existence. To be a stranger in a strange land is a bitter lot. No one notices you unless you happen to stand in their way. Often, when it was dark night outside, with rain or snow falling, the place looked quite deserted and gloomy. There were no lamps in the street, excepting a very small one, which hung at one end of the street, before a picture of the Virgin, which had been painted on the wall. The dashing of the water against the bulwarks of a neighboring castle could plainly be heard. Such evenings are long and dreary, unless people can find something to do, and so Antony found it. There were not always things to be packed or unpacked, nor paper bags to be made, nor the scales to be polished. So Antony invented employment. He mended his clothes and patched his boots, and when he at last went to bed, his nightcap, which he had worn from habit, still remained on his head. He had only to pull it down a little farther over his forehead. Very soon, however, it would be pushed up again to see if the light was properly put out. He would touch it, press the wick together, and at last pull his nightcap over his eyes and lie down again on the other side. But often there would rise in his mind a doubt as to whether every coal had been quite put out in the little fire-pan in the shop below. If even a tiny spark had remained, it might set fire to something, and cause great damage. Then he would rise from his bed, creep down the ladder, for it could scarcely be called a flight of stairs, and when he reached the fire-pan not a spark could be seen, so he had just to go back again to bed. But often, when he had got halfway back, he would fancy the iron shutters of the door were not properly fastened, and his thin legs would carry him down again. And when at last he crept into bed, he would be so cold that his teeth chattered in his head. He would draw the coverlet closer round him, pull his nightcap over his eyes, and try to turn his thoughts from trade, and from the labors of the day, to olden times. But this was scarcely an agreeable entertainment, for thoughts of olden memories raise the curtains from the past, and sometimes pierce the heart with painful recollections till the agony brings tears to the waking eyes. And so it was with Antony. Often the scalding tears, like pearly drops, would fall from his eyes to the coverlet and roll on the floor with a sound as if one of his heartstrings had broken. Sometimes, with a lurid flame, memory would light up a picture of life which had never faded from his heart. If he dried his eyes with his nightcap, then the tear and the picture would be crushed, but the source of the tears remained and welled up again in his heart. The pictures did not follow one another in order, as the circumstances they represented had occurred. Very often the most painful would come together, and when those came which were most full of joy, they had always the deepest shadow thrown upon them. The beechwoods of Denmark are acknowledged by everyone to be very beautiful, but more beautiful still in the eyes of old Antony were the beechwoods in the neighborhood of Wartburg. More grand and venerable to him seemed the old oaks around the proud baronial castle, where the creeping plants hung over the stony summits of the rocks. Sweeter was the perfume there of the apple blossom than in all the land of Denmark. How vividly were represented to him, in a glittering tear that rolled down his cheek, two children at play, a boy and a girl. The boy had rosy cheeks, golden ringlets, and clear, blue eyes. He was the son of Antony, a rich merchant. It was himself. The little girl had brown eyes and black hair, and was clever and courageous. She was the mayor's daughter, Molly. The children were playing with an apple. They shook the apple, and heard the pips rattling in it. Then they cut it in two, and each of them took half. They also divided the pips and ate all but one, which the little girl proposed should be placed in the ground. "You will see what will come out," she said, "something you don't expect. A whole apple tree will come out, but not directly." Then they got a flower pot, filled it with earth, and were soon both very busy and eager about it. The boy made a hole in the earth with his finger, and the little girl placed the pip in the hole, and then they both covered it over with earth. "Now you must not take it out tomorrow to see if it has taken root," said Molly. "No one ever should do that. I did so with my flowers, but only twice. I wanted to see if they were growing. I didn't know any better then, and the flowers all died." Little Antony kept the flower pot, and every morning during the whole winter he looked at it. But there was nothing to be seen but black earth. At last, however, the spring came, and the sun shone warm again, and then two little green leaves sprouted forth in the pot. "They are Molly and me," said the boy. "How wonderful they are, and so beautiful." Very soon a third leaf made its appearance. "Who does that stand for?" thought he, and then came another and another. Day after day, and week after week, till the plant became quite a tree. And all this about the two children was mirrored to old Antony in a single tear, which could soon be wiped away and disappear, but might come again from its source in the heart of the old man. In the neighborhood of Eisenach stretches a ridge of stony mountains, one of which has a rounded outline, and shows itself above the rest without tree, bush, or grass on its barren summits. It is called the Venus Mountain, and the story goes that the Lady Venus, one of the heathen goddesses, keeps house there. She is also called Lady Halle, as every child round Eisenach well knows. She it was who enticed the noble knight, Tannhäuser, the minstrel, from the circle of singers at Wartburg into her mountain. Little Molly and Antony often stood by this mountain, and one day Molly said, "Do you dare to knock and say, 'Lady Halle, Lady Halle, open the door, Tannhäuser is here'?" But Antony did not dare. Molly, however, did, though she only said the words, Lady Halle, loudly and distinctly. The rest she muttered so much under her breath that Antony felt certain she had really said nothing, and yet she looked quite bold and saucy, just as she did sometimes when she was in the garden with a number of other little girls. They would all stand round him together, and want to kiss him, because he did not like to be kissed, and pushed them away. Then Molly was the only one who dared to resist him. "I may kiss him," she would say proudly, as she threw her arms round his neck. She was vain of her power over Antony, for he would submit quietly and think nothing of it. Molly was very charming, but rather bold, and how she did tease. They said Lady Halle was beautiful, but her beauty was that of a tempting fiend. Saint Elizabeth, the tutelar saint of the land, the pious princess of Thuringia, whose good deeds have been immortalized in so many places through stories and legends, had greater beauty and more real grace. Her picture hung in the chapel, surrounded by silver lamps, but it did not in the least resemble Molly. The apple tree, which the two children had planted, grew year after year, till it became so large that it had to be transplanted into the garden, where the dew fell and the sun shone warmly. And there it increased in strength so much as to be able to withstand the cold of winter, and after passing through the severe weather, it seemed to put forth its blossoms in spring for very joy that the cold season had gone. In autumn it produced 2 apples, one for Molly and one for Antony. It could not well do less. The tree after this grew very rapidly, and Molly grew with the tree. She was as fresh as an apple blossom, but Antony was not to behold this flower for long. All things change. Molly's father left his old home, and Molly went with him far away. In our time, it would be only a journey of a few hours, but then it took more than a day and a night to travel so far eastward from Eisenbach to a town still called Weimar, on the borders of Thuringia. And Molly and Antony both wept, but these tears all flowed together into one tear which had the rosy shimmer of joy. Molly had told him that she loved him more than all the splendors of Weimar. 1, 2, 3 years went by, and during the whole time he received only 2 letters. One came by the carrier, and the other a traveler brought. The way was very long and difficult, with many turnings and windings through towns and villages. How often had Antony and Molly heard the story of Tristan and Isolde, and Antony had thought the story applied to him, although Tristan means born in sorrow, which Antony certainly was not, nor was it likely he would ever say of Molly as Tristan said of Isolde, "She has forgotten me." But in truth, Isolde had not forgotten him, her faithful friend, and when both were laid in their graves, one, on each side of the church, the linden trees that grew by each grave spread over the roof, and, bending towards each other, mingled their blossoms together. Antony thought it a very beautiful but mournful story, yet he never feared anything so sad would happen to him and Molly, as he passed the spot, whistling the air of a song, composed by the minstrel Walter, called the Willow Bird, beginning. Under the linden trees, out on the heath, one stanza pleased him exceedingly, through the forest, and in the vale, sweetly warbles the nightingale. This song was often in his mouth, and he sang or whistled it on a moonlight night, when he rode on horseback along the deep, hollow way, on his road to Weimar, to visit Molly. He wished to arrive unexpectedly, and so indeed he did. He was received with a hearty welcome, and introduced to plenty of grand and pleasant company, where overflowing wine cups were passed about. A pretty room and a good bed were provided for him, and yet his reception was not what he had expected and dreamed it would be. He could not comprehend his own feelings nor the feelings of others, but it is easily understood how a person can be admitted into a house or a family without becoming one of them. We converse in company with those we meet, as we converse with our fellow travelers in a stage-coach, on a journey. We know nothing of them, and perhaps all the while we are incommoding one another, and each is wishing himself or his neighbor away. Something of this kind Antony felt when Molly talked to him of old times. "I am a straightforward girl," she said, "and I will tell you myself how it is. There have been great changes since we were children together. Everything is different, both inwardly and outwardly. We cannot control our wills, nor the feelings of our hearts, by the force of custom. Antony, I would not, for the world, make an enemy of you when I am far away. Believe me, I entertain for you the kindest wishes in my heart, but to feel for you what I now know can be felt for another man, can never be. You must try and reconcile yourself to this. Farewell, Antony." Antony also said, "Farewell." Not a tear came into his eye. He felt he was no longer Molly's friend. Hot iron and cold iron alike take the skin from our lips, and we feel the same sensation if we kiss either, and Antony's kiss was now the kiss of hatred, as it had once been the kiss of love. Within 24 hours Antony was back again to Eisenach, though the horse that he rode was entirely ruined. "What matters it?" said he, "I am ruined also. I will destroy everything that can remind me of her, or of Lady Halley, or Lady Venus, the heathen woman. I will break down the apple tree, and tear it up by the roots. Never more shall it blossom or bear fruit." The apple tree was not broken down, for Antony himself was struck with a fever, which caused him to break down, and confined him to his bed. But something occurred to raise him up again. What was it? A medicine was offered to him, which he was obliged to take, a bitter remedy, at which the sick body and the oppressed spirit alike shuddered. Antony's father lost all his property, and, from being known as one of the richest merchants, he became very poor. Dark days, heavy trials, with poverty at the door, came rolling into the house upon them like the waves of the sea. Sorrow and suffering deprived Antony's father of his strength, so that he had something else to think of besides nursing his love sorrows and his anger against Molly. He had to take his father's place, to give orders, to act with energy, to help, and, at last, to go out into the world and earn his bread. Antony went to Bremen, and there he learned what poverty and hard living really were. These things often harden the character, but sometimes soften the heart, even too much. How different the world, and the people in it, appeared to Antony now, to what he had thought in his childhood. What to him were the minstrels' songs? An echo of the past, sounds long vanished. At times he would think in this way, yet again and again the songs would sound in his soul, and his heart become gentle and pious. "God's will is the best," he would then say. "It was well that I was not allowed to keep my power over Molly's heart. and that she did not remain true to me. How I should have felt it now, when fortune has deserted me. She left me before she knew of the change in my circumstances, or had a thought of what was before me. That is a merciful providence for me. All has happened for the best. She could not help it, and yet I have been so bitter, and in such enmity against her. Years passed by, Antony's father died, and strangers lived in the old house. He had seen it once again since then. His rich master sent him journeys on business, and on one occasion his way led him to his native town of Eisenach. The old Wartburg castle stood unchanged on the rock where the monk and the nun were hewn out of the stone. The great oaks formed an outline to the scene which he so well remembered in his childhood. The Venus mountain stood out grey and bare, overshadowing the valley beneath. He would have been glad to call out, Lady Halley, unlock the mountain. I would fain remain here always in my native soil. That was a sinful thought, and he offered a prayer to drive it away. Then a little bird in the thicket sang out clearly, and old Antony thought of the minstrel's song. How much came back to his remembrance as he looked through the tears once more on his native town. The old house was still standing as in olden times, but the garden had been greatly altered. A pathway led through a portion of the ground, and outside the garden, and beyond the path, stood the old apple tree, which he had not broken down, although he talked of doing so in his trouble. The sun still threw its rays upon the tree, and the refreshing dew fell upon it as of old, and it was so overloaded with fruit that the branches bent towards the earth with the weight. That flourishes still, said he, as he gazed. One of the branches of the tree had, however, been broken. Mischievous hands must have done this in passing, for the tree now stood in a public thoroughfare. The blossoms are often plucked, said Antony, the fruit is stolen and the branches broken without a thankful thought of their profusion and beauty. It might be said of a tree, as it has been said of some men, it was not predicted at his cradle that he should come to this. How brightly began the history of this tree, and what is it now? Forsaken and forgotten, in a garden by a hedge, in a field, and close to a public road. There it stands, unsheltered, plundered, and broken. It certainly has not yet withered, but in the course of years the number of blossoms from time to time will grow less, and at last it will cease altogether to bear fruit, and then its history will be over. Such were Antony's thoughts as he stood under the tree, and during many a long night as he lay in his lonely chamber in the wooden house in Husken Street, Copenhagen, in the foreign land to which the rich merchant of Bremen, his employer, had sent him on condition that he should never marry. Marry? Ha, ha. And he laughed bitterly to himself at the thought. Winter one year set in early, and it was freezing hard. Without, a snowstorm made everyone remain at home who could do so. Thus it happened that Antony's neighbors, who lived opposite to him, did not notice that his house remained unopened for 2 days, and that he had not showed himself during that time, for who would go out in such weather unless he were obliged to do so? They were grey, gloomy days, and in the house whose windows were not glass, twilight and dark nights reigned in turns. During these 2 days old Antony had not left his bed, he had not the strength to do so. The bitter weather had for some time affected his limbs. There lay the old bachelor, forsaken by all, and unable to help himself. He could scarcely reach the water jug that he had placed by his bed, and the last drop was gone. It was not fever, nor sickness, but old age, that had laid him low. In the little corner, where his bed lay, he was overshadowed as it were by perpetual night. A little spider, which he could however not see, busily and cheerfully spun its web above him, so that there should be a kind of little banner waving over the old man, when his eyes closed. The time passed slowly and painfully. He had no tears to shed, and he felt no pain, no thought of Molly came into his mind. He felt as if the world was now nothing to him, as if he were lying beyond it, with no one to think of him. Now and then he felt slight sensations of hunger and thirst, but no one came to him, no one tended him. He thought of all those who had once suffered from starvation, of Saint Elizabeth, who once wandered on the earth, the saint of his home and his childhood, the noble Duchess of Thuringia, that highly esteemed lady who visited the poorest villages, bringing hope and relief to the sick inmates. The recollection of her pious deeds was as light to the soul of poor Antony. He thought of her as she went about speaking words of comfort, binding up the wounds of the afflicted and feeding the hungry, although often blamed for it by her stern husband. He remembered a story told of her, that on one occasion, when she was carrying a basket full of wine and provisions, her husband, who had watched her footsteps, stepped forward and asked her angrily what she carried in her basket, whereupon, with fear and trembling, she answered, "Roses, which I have plucked from the garden." Then he tore away the cloth which covered the basket, and what could equal the surprise of the pious woman, to find that by a miracle, everything in her basket, the wine, the bread, had all been changed into roses. In this way the memory of the kind lady dwelt in the calm mind of Anthony. She was as a living reality in his little dwelling in the Danish land. He uncovered his face that he might look into her gentle eyes, while everything around him changed from its look of poverty and want, to a bright rose tint. The fragrance of roses spread through the room, mingled with the sweet smell of apples. He saw the branches of an apple tree spreading above him. It was the tree which he and Molly had planted together. The fragrant leaves of the tree fell upon him and cooled his burning brow, upon his parched lips they seemed like refreshing bread and wine, and as they rested on his breast, a peaceful calm stole over him, and he felt inclined to sleep. "I shall sleep now," he whispered to himself. "Sleep will do me good. In the morning I shall be upon my feet again, strong and well. Glorious. Wonderful. That apple tree, planted in love, now appears before me in heavenly beauty." And he slept. The following day, the third day during which his house had been closed, the snowstorm ceased. Then his opposite neighbor stepped over to the house in which old Anthony lived, for he had not yet showed himself. There he lay stretched on his bed, dead, with his old nightcap tightly clasped in his two hands. The nightcap, however, was not placed on his head in his coffin. He had a clean white one on then. Where now were the tears he had shed? What had become of those wonderful pearls? They were in the nightcap still. Such tears as these cannot be washed out, even when the nightcap is forgotten. The old thoughts and dreams of a bachelor's nightcap still remain. Never wish for such a nightcap. It would make your forehead hot, cause your pulse to beat with agitation, and conjure up dreams which would appear realities. The first who wore old Anthony's cap felt the truth of this, though it was half a century afterwards. That man was the mayor himself, who had already made a comfortable home for his wife and 11 children, by his industry. The moment he put the cap on he dreamed of unfortunate love, of bankruptcy, and of dark days. "Hello! How the nightcap burns!" he exclaimed, as he tore it from his bead. Then a pearl rolled out, and then another, and they glittered and sounded as they fell. What can this be? Is it paralysis, or something dazzling my eyes? They were the tears which old Anthony had shed half a century before. To everyone who afterwards put this cap on his head, came visions and dreams which agitated him not a little. His own history was changed into that of Anthony till it became quite a story, and many stories might be made by others, so we will leave them to relate their own. We have told the first, and our last word is, don't wish for a bachelor's nightcap. Chapter 65 The Old Church Bell, written for the Schiller album. In the country of Württemberg, in Germany, where the acacias grow by the public road, where the apple trees and the pear trees in autumn bend to the earth with the weight of the precious fruit, lies the little town of Marbach. As is often the case with many of these towns, it is charmingly situated on the banks of the river Neckar, which rushes rapidly by, passing villages, old knights' castles, and green vineyards, till its waters mingle with those of the stately Rhine. It was late in the autumn, the vine leaves still hung upon the branches of the vines, but they were already tinted with red and gold. Heavy showers fell on the surrounding country, and the cold autumn wind blew sharp and strong. It was not at all pleasant weather for the poor. The days grew shorter and more gloomy, and, dark as it was out of doors in the open air, it was still darker within the small, old-fashioned houses of the village. The gable end of one of these houses faced the street, and with its small, narrow windows, presented a very mean appearance. The family who dwelt in it were also very poor and humble, but they treasured the fear of God in their innermost hearts. And now he was about to send them a child. It was the hour of the mother's sorrow, when there pealed forth from the church tower the sound of festive bells. In that solemn hour the sweet and joyous chiming filled the hearts of those in the humble dwelling with thankfulness and trust, and when, amidst these joyous sounds, a little son was born to them, the words of prayer and praise arose from their overflowing hearts, and their happiness seemed to ring out over town and country in the liquid tones of the church bell's chime. The little one, with its bright eyes and golden hair, had been welcomed joyously on that dark November day. Its parents kissed it lovingly, and the father wrote these words in the Bible, on the 10th of November, 1759, God sent us a son. And a short time after, when the child had been baptized, the names he had received were added, John Christopher Frederick. And what became of the little lad? The poor boy of the humble town of Marbach. Ah, indeed, there was no one who thought or supposed, not even the old church bell which had been the first to sound and chime for him, that he would be the first to sing the beautiful song of the bell. The boy grew apace, and the world advanced with him. While he was yet a child, his parents removed from Marbach, and went to reside in another town, but their dearest friends remained behind at Marbach, and therefore sometimes the mother and her son would start on a fine day to pay a visit to the little town. The boy was at this time about 6 years old, and already knew a great many stories out of the Bible, and several religious psalms. While seated in the evening on his little cane chair, he had often heard his father read from Gellert's fables, and sometimes from Klopstock's grand poem, The Messiah. He and his sister, 2 years older than himself, had often wept scalding tears over the story of him who suffered death on the cross for us all. On his first visit to Marbach, the town appeared to have changed but very little, and it was not far enough away to be forgotten. The house, with its pointed gable, narrow windows, overhanging walls and stories, projecting one beyond another, looked just the same as in former times. But in the churchyard there were several new graves, and there also, in the grass, close by the wall, stood the old church bell. It had been taken down from its high position, in consequence of a crack in the metal which prevented it from ever chiming again, and a new bell now occupied its place. The mother and son were walking in the churchyard when they discovered the old bell, and they stood still to look at it. Then the mother reminded her little boy of what a useful bell this had been for many 100 years. It had chimed for weddings and for christenings, it had tolled for funerals, and to give the alarm in case of fire. With every event in the life of man the bell had made its voice heard. His mother also told him how the chiming of that old bell had once filled her heart with joy and confidence, and that in the midst of the sweet tones her child had been given to her. And the boy gazed on the large, old bell with the deepest interest. He bowed his head over it and kissed it, old, thrown away, and cracked as it was, and standing there amidst the grass and nettles. The boy never forgot what his mother told him, and the tones of the old bell reverberated in his heart till he reached manhood. In such sweet remembrance was the old bell cherished by the boy, who grew up in poverty to be tall and slender, with a freckled complexion and hair almost red, but his eyes were clear and blue as the deep sea. And what was his career to be? His career was to be good, and his future life enviable. We find him taking high honors at the military school in the division commanded by the member of a family high in position, and this was an honor, that is to say, good luck. He wore gaiters, stiff collars, and powdered hair, and by this he was recognized, and, indeed, he might be known by the word of command march. Halt. Front. The old church bell had long been quite forgotten, and no one imagined it would ever again be sent to the melting furnace to make it as it was before. No one could possibly have foretold this. Equally impossible would it have been to believe that the tones of the old bell still echoed in the heart of the boy from Marbach, or that one day they would ring out loud enough and strong enough to be heard all over the world. They had already been heard in the narrow space behind the school wall, even above the deafening sounds of march. Halt. Front. They had chimed so loudly in the heart of the youngster, that he had sung them to his companions, and their tones resounded to the very borders of the country. He was not a free scholar in the military school, neither was he provided with clothes or food. But he had his number, and his own peg, for everything here was ordered like clockwork, which we all know is of the greatest utility. People get on so much better together when their position and duties are understood. It is by pressure that a jewel is stamped. The pressure of regularity and discipline here stamped the jewel, which in the future the world so well knew. In the chief town of the province a great festival was being celebrated. The light streamed forth from thousands of lamps, and the rockets shot upwards towards the sky, filling the air with showers of colored fiery sparks. A record of this bright display will live in the memory of man, for through it the pupil in the military school was in tears and sorrow. He had dared to attempt to reach foreign territories unnoticed, and must therefore give up fatherland, mother, his dearest friends, all, or sink down into the stream of common life. The old church bell had still some comfort. It stood in the shelter of the church wall in Marbach, once so elevated, now quite forgotten. The wind roared around it, and could have readily related the story of its origin and of its sweet chimes, and the wind could also tell of him to whom he had brought fresh air when, in the woods of the neighboring country, he had sunk down exhausted with fatigue, with no other worldly possessions than hope for the future, and a written leaf from Fisco. The wind could have told that his only protector was an artist, who, by reading each leaf to him, made it plain, and that they amused themselves by playing at ninepins together. The wind could also describe the pale fugitive, who, for weeks and months, lay in a wretched little roadside inn, where the landlord got drunk and raved, and where the merrymakers had it all their own way. And he, the pale fugitive, sang of the ideal. For many heavy days and dark nights the heart must suffer to enable it to endure trial and temptation, yet, amidst it all, would the minstrel sing. Dark days and cold nights also passed over the old bell, and it noticed them not. But the bell in the man's heart felt it to be a gloomy time. What would become of this young man, and what would become of the old bell? The old bell was, after a time, carried away to a greater distance than anyone, even the warder in the bell tower, ever imagined, and the bell in the breast of the young man was heard in countries where his feet had never wandered. The tones went forth over the wide ocean to every part of the round world. We will now follow the career of the old bell. It was, as we have said, carried far away from Marbach and sold as old copper, then sent to Bavaria to be melted down in a furnace. And then what happened? In the royal city of Bavaria, many years after the bell had been removed from the tower and melted down, some metal was required for a monument in honor of one of the most celebrated characters which a German people or a German land could produce. And now we see how wonderfully things are ordered. Strange things sometimes happen in this world. In Denmark, in one of those green islands where the foliage of the beechwoods rustles in the wind, and where many Huns' graves may be seen, was another poor boy born. He wore wooden shoes, and when his father worked in a shipyard, the boy, wrapped up in an old worn-out shawl, carried his dinner to him every day. This poor child was now the pride of his country, for the sculptured marble, the work of his hands, had astonished the world. To him was offered the honor of forming from the clay, a model of the figure of him whose name, John Christopher Frederick, had been written by his father in the Bible. The bust was cast in bronze, and part of the metal used for this purpose was the old church bell, whose tones had died away from the memory of those at home and elsewhere. The metal, glowing with heat, flowed into the mold, and formed the head and bust of the statue which was unveiled in the square inches front of the old castle. The statue represented in living, breathing reality, the form of him who was born in poverty, the boy from Marbach, the pupil of the military school, the fugitive who struggled against poverty and oppression, from the outer world, Germany's great and immortal poet, who sung of Switzerland's deliverer, William Tell, and of the heaven-inspired Maid of Orleans. It was a beautiful sunny day, flags were waving from tower and roof in Royal Stuttgart, and the church bells were ringing a joyous peal. One bell was silent, but it was illuminated by the bright sunshine which streamed from the head and bust of the renowned figure, of which it formed a part. On this day, just 100 years had passed since the day on which the chiming of the old church bell at Marbach had filled the mother's heart with trust and joy, the day on which her child was born in poverty, and in a humble home, the same who, in after years, became rich, became the noble woman-hearted poet, a blessing to the world, the glorious, the sublime, the immortal bard, John Christopher Frederick Schiller. Chapter 66. The Old Gravestone. In a house, with a large courtyard, in a provincial town, at that time of the year in which people say the evenings are growing longer, a family circle were gathered together at their old home. A lamp burned on the table, although the weather was mild and warm, and the long curtains hung down before the open windows, and without the moon shone brightly in the dark blue sky. But they were not talking of the moon, but of a large, old stone that lay below in the courtyard not very far from the kitchen door. The maids often laid the clean copper saucepans and kitchen vessels on this stone, that they might dry in the sun, and the children were fond of playing on it. It was, in fact, an old gravestone. Yes, said the master of the house, I believe the stone came from the graveyard of the old church of the convent which was pulled down, and the pulpit, the monuments, and the gravestone sold. My father bought the latter. Most of them were cut in two and used for paving stones, but that one stone was preserved whole, and laid in the courtyard. Anyone can see that it is a gravestone, said the eldest of the children. The representation of an hourglass and part of the figure of an angel can still be traced, but the inscription beneath is quite worn out, excepting the name Preben, and a large S close by it, and a little further down the name of Martha can be easily read. But nothing more, and even that cannot be seen unless it has been raining, or when we have washed the stone. Dear me! How singular! Why, that must be the gravestone of Preben Schwein and his wife. The old man who said this looked old enough to be the grandfather of all present in the room. Yes, he continued, these people were among the last who were buried in the churchyard of the old convent. They were a very worthy old couple. I can remember them well in the days of my boyhood. Everyone knew them, and they were esteemed by all. They were the oldest residents in the town, and people said they possessed a ton of gold, yet they were always very plainly dressed, in the coarsest stuff, but with linen of the purest whiteness. Preben and Martha were a fine old couple, and when they both sat on the bench, at the top of the steep stone steps, in front of their house, with the branches of the linden tree waving above them, and nodded in a gentle, friendly way to passers-by, it really made one feel quite happy. They were very good to the poor, they fed them and clothed them, and in their benevolence there was judgment as well as true Christianity. The old woman died first. That day is still quite vividly before my eyes. I was a little boy, and had accompanied my father to the old man's house. Martha had fallen into the sleep of death just as we arrived there. The corpse lay in a bedroom, near to the one in which we sat, and the old man was in great distress and weeping like a child. He spoke to my father, and to a few neighbors who were there, of how lonely he should feel now she was gone, and how good and true she, his dead wife, had been during the number of years that they had passed through life together, and how they had become acquainted, and learned to love each other. I was, as I have said, a boy, and only stood by and listened to what the others said, but it filled me with a strange emotion to listen to the old man, and to watch how the color rose in his cheeks as he spoke of the days of their courtship, of how beautiful she was, and how many little tricks he had been guilty of, that he might meet her. And then he talked of his wedding day, and his eyes brightened, and he seemed to be carried back, by his words, to the joyful time. And yet there she was, lying in the next room, dead, an old woman, and he was an old man, speaking of the days of hope, long passed away. Ah, well, so it is. Then I was but a child, and now I am old as Preben then was. Time passes away, and all things changed. I can remember quite well the day on which he was buried, and how old Preben walked close behind the coffin. A few years before this time the old couple had had their gravestone prepared, with an inscription and their names, but not the date. In the evening the stone was taken to the churchyard, and laid on the grave. A year later it was taken up, that old Preben might be laid by the side of his wife. They did not leave behind them wealth, they left behind them far less than people had believed they possessed. What there was went to families distantly related to them, of whom, till then, no one had ever heard. The old house, with its balcony of wickerwork, and the bench at the top of the high steps, under the lime tree, was considered, by the road inspectors, too old and rotten to be left standing. Afterwards, when the same fate befell the convent church, and the graveyard was destroyed, the gravestone of Preben and Martha, like everything else, was sold to whoever would buy it. And so it happened that this stone was not cut into as many others had been, but now lies in the courtyard below, a scouring block for the maids, and a playground for the children. The paved street now passes over the resting place of old Preben and his wife. No one thinks of them any more now. And the old man who had spoken of all this shook his head mournfully, and said, "Forgotten. Ah, yes, everything will be forgotten." And then the conversation turned on other matters. But the youngest child in the room, a boy, with large, earnest eyes, mounted upon a chair behind the window curtains, and looked out into the yard, where the moon was pouring a flood of light on the old gravestone, the stone that had always appeared to him so dull and flat, but which lay there now like a great leaf out of a book of history. All that the boy had heard of old Preben and his wife seemed clearly defined on the stone, and as he gazed on it, and glanced at the clear, bright moon shining in the pure air, it was as if the light of God's countenance beamed over his beautiful world. Forgotten. Everything will be forgotten. Still echoed through the room, and in the same moment an invisible spirit whispered to the heart of the boy, "Preserve carefully the seed that has been entrusted to thee, that it may grow and thrive. Guard it well. Through thee, my child, shall the obliterated inscription on the old, weather-beaten gravestone go forth to future generations in clear, golden characters. The old pair shall again wander through the streets arm in arm, or sit with their fresh, healthy cheeks on the bench under the lime tree, and smile and nod at rich and poor. The seed of this hour shall ripen in the course of years into a beautiful poem. The beautiful and the good are never forgotten, they live always in story or in song." Chapter 67 The Old House. A very old house stood once in a street with several that were quite new and clean. The date of its erection had been carved on one of the beams, and surrounded by scrolls formed of tulips and hop tendrils. By this date it could be seen that the old house was nearly 300 years old. Verses too were written over the windows in old-fashioned letters, and grotesque faces, curiously carved, grinned at you from under the cornices. One story projected a long way over the other, and under the roof ran a leaden gutter, with a dragon's head at the end. The rain was intended to pour out at the dragon's mouth, but it ran out of his body instead, for there was a hole in the gutter. The other houses in the street were new and well built, with large window panes and smooth walls. Anyone could see they had nothing to do with the old house. Perhaps they thought, how long will that heap of rubbish remain here to be a disgrace to the whole street? The parapet projects so far forward that no one can see out of our windows what is going on in that direction. The stairs are as broad as the staircase of a castle, and as steep as if they led to a church tower. The iron railing looks like the gate of a cemetery, and there are brass knobs upon it. It is really too ridiculous. Opposite to the old house were more nice new houses, which had just the same opinion as their neighbors. At the window of one of them sat a little boy with fresh rosy cheeks, and clear sparkling eyes, who was very fond of the old house, in sunshine or in moonlight. He would sit and look at the wall from which the plaster had in some places fallen off, and fancy all sorts of scenes which had been in former times. How the street must have looked when the houses had all gable roofs, open staircases, and gutters with dragons at the spout. He could even see soldiers walking about with halberds. Certainly it was a very good house to look at for amusement. An old man lived in it, who wore knee breeches, a coat with large brass buttons, and a wig, which anyone could see was a real wig. Every morning an old man came to clean the rooms, and to wait upon him, otherwise the old man in the knee breeches would have been quite alone in the house. Sometimes he came to one of the windows and looked out, then the little boy nodded to him, and the old man nodded back again, till they became acquainted, and were friends, although they had never spoken to each other, but that was of no consequence. The little boy one day heard his parents say, "The old man opposite is very well off, but is terribly lonely." The next Sunday morning the little boy wrapped something in a piece of paper and took it to the door of the old house, and said to the attendant who waited upon the old man, "Will you please give this from me to the gentleman who lives here? I have 2 tin soldiers, and this is one of them, and he shall have it, because I know he is terribly lonely." And the old attendant nodded and looked very pleased, and then he carried the tin soldier into the house. Afterwards he was sent over to ask the little boy if he would not like to pay a visit himself. His parents gave him permission, and so it was that he gained admission to the old house. The brassy knobs on the railings shone more brightly than ever, as if they had been polished on account of his visit, and on the door were carved trumpeters standing in tulips, and it seemed as if they were blowing with all their might, their cheeks were so puffed out. "Tantarara, the little boy is coming, Tantarara, the little boy is coming." Then the door opened. All round the hall hung old portraits of knights in armor, and ladies in silk gowns, and the armor rattled, and the silk dresses rustled. Then came a staircase which went up a long way, and then came down a little way and led to a balcony, which was in a very ruinous state. There were large holes and long cracks, out of which grew grass and leaves. Indeed the whole balcony, the courtyard, and the walls were so overgrown with green that they looked like a garden. In the balcony stood flower pots, on which were heads having asses' ears, but the flowers in them grew just as they pleased. In one pot pinks were growing all over the sides, at least the green leaves were shooting forth stalk and stem, and saying as plainly as they could speak, "The air has fanned me, the sun has kissed me, and I am promised a little flower for next Sunday, really for next Sunday." Then they entered a room in which the walls were covered with leather, and the leather had golden flowers stamped upon it. Gilding will fade in damp weather. To endure, there is nothing like leather, said the walls. Chairs handsomely carved, with elbows on each side, and with very high backs, stood in the room, and as they creaked they seemed to say, "Sit down. Oh dear, how I am creaking. I shall certainly have the gout like the old cupboard. Gout in my back, ugh." And then the little boy entered the room where the old man sat. "Thank you for the tin soldier, my little friend," said the old man, "and thank you also for coming to see me." "Thanks, thanks," or creak, creak, said all the furniture. There was so much that the pieces of furniture stood in each other's way to get a sight of the little boy. On the wall near the center of the room hung the picture of a beautiful lady, young and gay, dressed in the fashion of the olden times, with powdered hair, and a full, stiff skirt. She said neither thanks nor creak, but she looked down upon the little boy with her mild eyes, and then he said to the old man, "Where did you get that picture?" "From the shop opposite," he replied. "Many portraits hang there that none seem to trouble themselves about. The persons they represent have been dead and buried long since. But I knew this lady many years ago, and she has been dead nearly half a century." Under a glass beneath the picture hung a nosegay of withered flowers, which were no doubt half a century old too, at least they appeared so. And the pendulum of the old clock went to and fro, and the hands turned round, and as time passed on, everything in the room grew older. But no one seemed to notice it. "They say at home," said the little boy, "that you are very lonely." "Oh," replied the old man, "I have pleasant thoughts of all that has passed, recalled by memory, and now you are come to visit me, and that is very pleasant." Then he took from the bookcase, a book full of pictures representing long processions of wonderful coaches, such as are never seen at the present time. Soldiers like the knave of clubs, and citizens with waving banners. The tailors had a flag with a pair of scissors supported by 2 lions, and on the shoemaker's flag there were not boots, but an eagle with 2 heads, for the shoemakers must have everything arranged so that they can say, "This is a pair." What a picture book it was, and then the old man went into another room to fetch apples and nuts. It was very pleasant, certainly, to be in that old house. "I cannot endure it," said the tin soldier, who stood on a shelf. "It is so lonely and dull here. I have been accustomed to live in a family, and I cannot get used to this life. I cannot bear it. The whole day is long enough, but the evening is longer. It is not here like it was in your house opposite, when your father and mother talked so cheerfully together, while you and all the dear children made such a delightful noise. No, it is all lonely in the old man's house. Do you think he gets any kisses? Do you think he ever has friendly looks, or a Christmas tree? He will have nothing now but the grave. Oh, I cannot bear it. You must not look only on the sorrowful side," said the little boy. "I think everything in this house is beautiful, and all the old pleasant thoughts come back here to pay visits." "Ah, but I never see any, and I don't know them," said the tin soldier, "and I cannot bear it." "You must bear it," said the little boy. Then the old man came back with a pleasant face, and brought with him beautiful preserved fruits, as well as apples and nuts, and the little boy thought no more of the tin soldier. How happy and delighted the little boy was, and after he returned home, and while days and weeks passed, a great deal of nodding took place from one house to the other, and then the little boy went to pay another visit. The carved trumpeters blew Tantarara. "There is the little boy. Tantarara." The swords and armor on the old knight's pictures rattled. The silk dresses rustled, the leather repeated its rhyme, and the old chairs had the gout in their backs, and cried, creak. It was all exactly like the first time, for in that house, 1 day and 1 hour were just like another. "I cannot bear it any longer," said the tin soldier. "I have wept tears of tin, it is so melancholy here. Let me go to the wars, and lose an arm or a leg, that would be some change. I cannot bear it. Now I know what it is to have visits from one's old recollections, and all they bring with them. I have had visits from mine, and you may believe me it is not altogether pleasant. I was very nearly jumping from the shelf. I saw you all in your house opposite, as if you were really present. It was Sunday morning, and you children stood round the table, singing the hymn that you sing every morning. You were standing quietly, with your hands folded, and your father and mother. You were standing quietly, with your hands folded, and your father and mother were looking just as serious, when the door opened, and your little sister Maria, who is not 2 years old, was brought into the room. You know she always dances when she hears music and singing of any sort, so she began to dance immediately, although she ought not to have done so, but she could not get into the right time because the tune was so slow, so she stood first on one leg and then on the other, and bent her head very low, but it would not suit the music. You all stood looking very grave, although it was very difficult to do so, but I laughed so to myself that I fell down from the table, and got a bruise, which is the still. I know it was not right to laugh. So all this, and everything else that I have seen, keeps running in my head, and these must be the old recollections that bring so many thoughts with them. Tell me whether you still sing on Sundays, and tell me about your little sister Maria, and how my old comrade is. The other tin soldier. Ah, really he must be very happy. I cannot endure this life. You are given away, said the little boy, you must stay. Don't you see that? Then the old man came in, with a box containing many curious things to show him. Rouge pots, scent boxes, and old cards, so large and so richly gilded, that none are ever seen like them in these days. And there were smaller boxes to look at, and the piano was opened, and inside the lid were painted landscapes. But when the old man played, the piano sounded quite out of tune. Then he looked at the picture he had bought at the broker's, and his eyes sparkled brightly as he nodded at it, and said, "Ah, she could sing that tune. I will go to the wars. I will go to the wars," cried the tin soldier as loud as he could, and threw himself down on the floor. Where could he have fallen? The old man searched, and the little boy searched, but he was gone, and could not be found. "I shall find him again," said the old man, but he did not find him. The boards of the floor were open and full of holes. The tin soldier had fallen through a crack between the boards, and lay there now in an open grave. The day went by, and the little boy returned home. The week passed, and many more weeks. It was winter, and the windows were quite frozen, so the little boy was obliged to breathe on the panes, and rub a hole to peep through at the old house. Snowdrifts were lying in all the scrolls and on the inscriptions, and the steps were covered with snow as if no one were at home. And indeed nobody was home, for the old man was dead. In the evening, a hearse stopped at the door, and the old man in his coffin was placed in it. He was to be taken to the country to be buried there in his own grave, so they carried him away. No one followed him, for all his friends were dead, and the little boy kissed his hand to the coffin as the hearse moved away with it. A few days after, there was an auction at the old house, and from his window the little boy saw the people carrying away the pictures of old knights and ladies, the flower pots with the long ears, the old chairs, and the cupboards. Some were taken one way, some another. Her portrait, which had been bought at the picture dealer's, went back again to his shop, and there it remained, for no one seemed to know her, or to care for the old picture. In the spring, they began to pull the house itself down. People called it complete rubbish. From the street could be seen the room in which the walls were covered with leather, ragged and torn, and the green in the balcony hung straggling over the beams. They pulled it down quickly, for it looked ready to fall, and at last it was cleared away altogether. "What a good riddance," said the neighbors' houses. Very shortly, a fine new house was built further back from the road. It had lofty windows and smooth walls, but in front, on the spot where the old house really stood, a little garden was planted, and wild vines grew up over the neighboring walls. In front of the garden were large iron railings and a great gate, which looked very stately. People used to stop and peep through the railings. The sparrows assembled in dozens upon the wild vines, and chattered all together as loud as they could, but not about the old house. None of them could remember it, for many years had passed by, so many indeed, that the little boy was now a man, and a really good man too, and his parents were very proud of him. He was just married, and had come, with his young wife, to reside in the new house with a garden in front of it, and now he stood by her side while she planted a field flower that she thought very pretty. She was planting it herself with her little hands, and pressing down the earth with her fingers. "Oh dear, what was that?" she exclaimed, as something pricked her. Out of the soft earth something was sticking up. It was only think! It was really the tin soldier. The very same which had been lost up in the old man's room, and had been hidden among old wood and rubbish for a long time, till it sunk into the earth, where it must have been for many years. And the young wife wiped the soldier, first with a green leaf, and then with her fine pocket handkerchief, that smelt of such beautiful perfume. And the tin soldier felt as if he was recovering from a fainting fit. "Let me see him," said the young man, and then he smiled and shook his head, and said, "It can scarcely be the same, but it reminds me of something that happened to one of my tin soldiers when I was a little boy." And then he told his wife about the old house and the old man, and of the tin soldier which he had sent across, because he thought the old man was lonely, and he related the story so clearly that tears came into the eyes of the young wife for the old house and the old man. "It is very likely that this is really the same soldier," said she, "and I will take care of him, and always remember what you have told me, but some day you must show me the old man's grave." "I don't know where it is," he replied, "no one knows. All his friends are dead, no one took care of him, and I was only a little boy." "Oh, how dreadfully lonely he must have been," said she. "Yes, terribly lonely," cried the tin soldier, "still it is delightful not to be forgotten." "Delightful indeed," cried a voice quite near to them. No one but the tin soldier saw that it came from a rag of the leather which hung in tatters. It had lost all its gilding, and looked like wet earth, but it had an opinion, and it spoke it thus: "Gilding will fade in damp weather. To endure, there is nothing like leather." But the tin soldier did not believe any such thing. Chapter 68. What the old man does is always right. I will tell you a story that was told me when I was a little boy. Every time I thought of this story, it seemed to me more and more charming, for it is with stories as it is with many people, they become better as they grow older. I have no doubt that you have been in the country, and seen a very old farmhouse, with a thatched roof, and mosses and small plants growing wild upon it. There is a stork's nest on the ridge of the gable, for we cannot do without the stork. The walls of the house are sloping, and the windows are low, and only one of the latter is made to open. The baking oven sticks out of the wall like a great knob. An elder tree hangs over the palings, and beneath its branches, at the foot of the paling, is a pool of water, in which a few ducks are disporting themselves. There is a yard dog too, who barks at all corners. Just such a farmhouse as this stood in a country lane, and in it dwelt an old couple, a peasant and his wife. Small as their possessions were, they had one article they could not do without, and that was a horse, which contrived to live upon the grass which it found by the side of the high road. The old peasant rode into the town upon this horse, and his neighbors often borrowed it of him, and paid for the loan of it by rendering some service to the old couple. After a time they thought it would be as well to sell the horse, or exchange it for something which might be more useful to them. But what might this something be? "You'll know best, old man," said the wife. "It is fair day today, so ride into town, and get rid of the horse for money, or make a good exchange, whichever you do will be right to me, so ride to the fair. and she fastened his neckerchief for him, for she could do that better than he could, and she could also tie it very prettily in a double bow. She also smoothed his hat round and round with the palm of her hand, and gave him a kiss. Then he rode away upon the horse that was to be sold or bartered for something else. Yes, the old man knew what he was about. The sun shone with great heat, and not a cloud was to be seen in the sky. The road was very dusty, for a number of people, all going to the fair, were driving, riding, or walking upon it. There was no shelter anywhere from the hot sunshine. Among the rest a man came trudging along, and driving a cow to the fair. The cow was as beautiful a creature as any cow could be. She gives good milk, I am certain, said the peasant to himself. That would be a very good exchange, the cow for the horse. Hello there. You with the cow, he said. I tell you what, I dare say a horse is of more value than a cow, but I don't care for that, a cow will be more useful to me, so, if you like, we'll exchange. To be sure I will, said the man. Accordingly the exchange was made, and as the matter was settled, the peasant might have turned back, for he had done the business he came to do. But, having made up his mind to go to the fair, he determined to do so, if only to have a look at it, so on he went to the town with his cow. Leading the animal, he strode on sturdily, and, after a short time, overtook a man who was driving a sheep. It was a good fat sheep, with a fine fleece on its back. I should like to have that fellow, said the peasant to himself. There is plenty of grass for him by our palings, and in the winter we could keep him in the room with us. Perhaps it would be more profitable to have a sheep than a cow. Shall I exchange? The man with the sheep was quite ready, and the bargain was quickly made. And then our peasant continued his way on the highroad with his sheep. Soon after this, he overtook another man, who had come into the road from a field, and was carrying a large goose under his arm. What a heavy creature you have there, said the peasant. It has plenty of feathers and plenty of fat, and would look well tied to a string, or paddling in the water at our place. That would be very useful to my old woman, she could make all sorts of profits out of it. How often she has said, if now we only had a goose. Now here is an opportunity, and, if possible, I will get it for her. Shall we exchange? I will give you my sheep for your goose, and thanks into the bargain. The other had not the least objection, and accordingly the exchange was made, and our peasant became possessor of the goose. By this time he had arrived very near the town. The crowd on the highroad had been gradually increasing, and there was quite a rush of men and cattle. The cattle walked on the path and by the palings, and at the turnpike gate they even walked into the tollkeeper's potato field, where one fowl was strutting about with a string tied to its leg, for fear it should take fright at the crowd, and run away and get lost. The tail feathers of the fowl were very short, and it winked with both its eyes, and looked very cunning, as it said cluck, cluck. What were the thoughts of the fowl as it said this I cannot tell you, but directly our good man saw it, he thought, why that's the finest fowl I ever saw in my life, it's finer than our parson's brood hen, upon my word. I should like to have that fowl. Fowls can always pick up a few grains that lie about, and almost keep themselves. I think it would be a good exchange if I could get it for my goose. Shall we exchange? He asked the tollkeeper. Exchange, repeated the man. Well, it would not be a bad thing. And so they made an exchange, the tollkeeper at the turnpike gate kept the goose, and the peasant carried off the fowl. Now he had really done a great deal of business on his way to the fair, and he was hot and tired. He wanted something to eat, and a glass of ale to refresh himself, so he turned his steps to an inn. He was just about to enter when the ostler came out, and they met at the door. The ostler was carrying a sack. What have you in that sack? Asked the peasant. Rotten apples, answered the ostler, a whole sackful of them. They will do to feed the pigs with. Why, that will be terrible waste, he replied. I should like to take them home to my old woman. Last year the old apple tree by the grass plot only bore one apple, and we kept it in the cupboard till it was quite withered and rotten. It was always property, my old woman said, and here she would see a great deal of property, a whole sackful. I should like to show them to her. What will you give me for the sackful? Asked the ostler. What will I give? Well, I will give you my fowl in exchange. So he gave up the fowl, and received the apples, which he carried into the inn parlor. He leaned the sack carefully against the stove, and then went to the table. But the stove was hot, and he had not thought of that. Many guests were present, horse dealers, cattle drovers, and 2 Englishmen. The Englishmen were so rich that their pockets quite bulged out and seemed ready to burst, and they could bet too, as you shall hear. Hiss. What could that be by the stove? The apples were beginning to roast. What is that? Asked one. Why, do you know, said our peasant. and then he told them the whole story of the horse, which he had exchanged for a cow, and all the rest of it, down to the apples. "Well, your old woman will give it you well when you get home," said one of the Englishmen. "Won't there be a noise?" "What? Give me what?" said the peasant. "Why, she will kiss me, and say, 'What the old man does is always right.'" "Let us lay a wager on it," said the Englishman. "We'll wager you a ton of coined gold, 100 pounds to the hundredweight." "No, a bushel will be enough," replied the peasant. "I can only set a bushel of apples against it, and I'll throw myself and my old woman into the bargain. That will pile up the measure, I fancy." "Done. Taken." And so the bet was made. Then the landlord's coach came to the door, and the two Englishmen and the peasant got in, and away they drove, and soon arrived and stopped at the peasant's hut. "Good evening, old woman." "Good evening, old man. I've made the exchange." "Ah, well, you understand what you're about," said the woman. Then she embraced him, and paid no attention to the strangers, nor did she notice the sack. "I got a cow in exchange for the horse, thank heaven," said she. "Now we shall have plenty of milk, and butter, and cheese on the table." "That was a capital exchange." "Yes, but I changed the cow for a sheep." "Ah, better still," cried the wife. "You always think of everything. We've just enough pasture for a sheep. Use milk and cheese, wool and jackets and stockings. The cow could not give all these, and her hair only falls off. How you think of everything. But I changed away the sheep for a goose, then we shall have roast goose to eat this year. You dear old man, you are always thinking of something to please me. This is delightful. We can let the goose walk about with a string tied to her leg, so she will be fatter still before we roast her. But I gave away the goose for a fowl, a fowl." "Well, that was a good exchange," replied the woman. "The fowl will lay eggs and hatch them, and we shall have chickens. We shall soon have a poultry yard." "Oh, this is just what I was wishing for." "Yes, but I exchanged the fowl for a sack of shriveled apples." "What? I really must give you a kiss for that," exclaimed the wife. "My dear, good husband, now I'll tell you something. Do you know, almost as soon as you left me this morning, I began to think of what I could give you nice for supper this evening, and then I thought of fried eggs and bacon, with sweet herbs. I had eggs and bacon, but I wanted the herbs, so I went over to the schoolmaster's. I knew they had plenty of herbs, but the schoolmistress is very mean, although she can smile so sweetly. I begged her to lend me a handful of herbs." "Lend?" she exclaimed. "I have nothing to lend, nothing at all grows in our garden, not even a shriveled apple. I could not even lend you a shriveled apple, my dear woman. But now I can lend her 10, or a whole sackful, which I'm very glad of. It makes me laugh to think about it." And then she gave him a hearty kiss. "Well, I like all this," said both the Englishmen, "always going down the hill, and yet always merry. It's worth the money to see it." So they paid 100 weight of gold to the peasant, who, whatever he did, was not scolded but kissed. Yes, it always pays best when the wife sees and maintains that her husband knows best, and whatever he does is right. That is a story which I heard when I was a child, and now you have heard it too, and know that what the old man does is always right. Chapter 69 The Old Street Lamp. Did you ever hear the story of the old street lamp? It is not remarkably interesting, but for once in a way you may as well listen to it. It was a most respectable old lamp, which had seen many, many years of service, and now was to retire with a pension. It was this evening at its post for the last time, giving light to the street. His feelings were something like those of an old dancer at the theatre, who is dancing for the last time, and knows that on the morrow she will be in her garret, alone and forgotten. The lamp had very great anxiety about the next day, for he knew that he had to appear for the first time at the town hall, to be inspected by the mayor and the council, who were to decide if he were fit for further service or not. Whether the lamp was good enough to be used to light the inhabitants of one of the suburbs, or in the country, at some factory, and if not, it would be sent at once to an iron foundry, to be melted down. In this latter case it might be turned into anything, and he wondered very much whether he would then be able to remember that he had once been a street lamp, and it troubled him exceedingly. Whatever might happen, one thing seemed certain, that he would be separated from the watchman and his wife, whose family he looked upon as his own. The lamp had first been hung up on that very evening that the watchman, then a robust young man, had entered upon the duties of his office. Well, it was a very long time since one became a lamp and the other a watchman. His wife had a little pride in those days. She seldom condescended to glance at the lamp, excepting when she passed by in the evening, never in the daytime. But in later years, when all these the watchman, the wife, and the lamp had grown old. She had attended to it, cleaned it, and supplied it with oil. The old people were thoroughly honest, they had never cheated the lamp of a single drop of the oil provided for it. This was the lamp's last night in the street, and tomorrow he must go to the town hall. Two very dark things to think of. No wonder he did not burn brightly. Many other thoughts also passed through his mind. How many persons he had lighted on their way, and how much he had seen, as much, very likely, as the mayor and corporation themselves. None of these thoughts were uttered aloud, however, for he was a good, honorable old lamp, who would not willingly do harm to anyone, especially to those in authority. As many things were recalled to his mind, the light would flash up with sudden brightness. He had, at such moments, a conviction that he would be remembered. There was a handsome young man once, thought he, it is certainly a long while ago, but I remember he had a little note, written on pink paper with a gold edge. The writing was elegant, evidently a lady's hand. Twice he read it through, and kissed it, and then looked up at me, with eyes that said quite plainly, I am the happiest of men. Only he and I know what was written on this, his first letter from his lady love. Yes, and there was another pair of eyes that I remember. It is really wonderful how the thoughts jump from one thing to another. A funeral passed through the street. A young and beautiful woman lay on a bier, decked with garlands of flowers, and attended by torches, which quite overpowered my light. All along the street stood the people from the houses, in crowds, ready to join the procession. But when the torches had passed from before me, and I could look round, I saw one person alone, standing, leaning against my post, and weeping. Never shall I forget the sorrowful eyes that looked up at me. These and similar reflections occupied the old street lamp, on this the last time that his light would shine. The sentry, when he is relieved from his post, knows at least who will succeed him, and may whisper a few words to him, but the lamp did not know his successor, or he could have given him a few hints respecting rain, or mist, and could have informed him how far the moon's rays would rest on the pavement, and from which side the wind generally blew, and so on. On the bridge over the canal stood 3 persons, who wished to recommend themselves to the lamp, for they thought he could give the office to whomsoever he chose. The first was a herring's head, which could emit light in the darkness. He remarked that it would be a great saving of oil if they placed him on the lamp post. Number 2 was a piece of rotten wood, which also shines in the dark. He considered himself descended from an old stem, once the pride of the forest. The third was a glowworm, and how he found his way to the lamp could not imagine, yet there he was, and could really give light as well as the others. But the rotten wood and the herring's head declared most solemnly, by all they held sacred, that the glowworm only gave light at certain times, and must not be allowed to compete with themselves. The old lamp assured them that not one of them could give sufficient light to fill the position of a street lamp, but they would believe nothing he said. And when they discovered that he had not the power of naming his successor, they said they were very glad to hear it, for the lamp was too old and worn out to make a proper choice. At this moment the wind came rushing round the corner of the street, and through the air holes of the old lamp. "What is this I hear?" said he, "that you are going away tomorrow? Is this evening the last time we shall meet? Then I must present you with a farewell gift. I will blow into your brain, so that in future you shall not only be able to remember all that you have seen or heard in the past, but your light within shall be so bright, that you shall be able to understand all that is said or done in your presence." "Oh, that is really a very, very great gift," said the old lamp. "I thank you most heartily. I only hope I shall not be melted down." "That is not likely to happen yet," said the wind, "and I will also blow a memory into you, so that should you receive other similar presents your old age will pass very pleasantly." "That is if I am not melted down," said the lamp. "But should I in that case still retain my memory? Do be reasonable, old lamp," said the wind, puffing away. At this moment the moon burst forth from the clouds. "What will you give the old lamp?" asked the wind. "I can give nothing," she replied. "I am on the wane, and no lamps have ever given me light while I have frequently shone upon them." And with these words the moon hid herself again behind the clouds, that she might be saved from further importunities. Just then a drop fell upon the lamp, from the roof of the house, but the drop explained that he was a gift from those grey clouds, and perhaps the best of all gifts. "I shall penetrate you so thoroughly," he said, "that you will have the power of becoming rusty, and, if you wish it, to crumble into dust in one night." But this seemed to the lamp a very shabby present, and the wind thought so too. "Does no one give any more? Will no one give any more?" shouted the breath of the wind, as loud as it could. Then a bright falling star came down, leaving a broad, luminous streak behind it. "What was that?" cried the herring's head. "Did not a star fall? I really believe it went into the lamp." "Certainly," when such high-born personages try for the office, we may as well say good night, and go home. And so they did, all three, while the old lamp threw a wonderfully strong light all around him. "This is a glorious gift," said he. "The bright stars have always been a joy to me, and have always shone more brilliantly than I ever could shine, though I have tried with my whole might, and now they have noticed me, a poor old lamp, and have sent me a gift that will enable me to see clearly everything that I remember, as if it still stood before me, and to be seen by all those who love me. And herein lies the truest pleasure, for joy which we cannot share with others is only half enjoyed." "That sentiment does you honor," said the wind, "but for this purpose wax lights will be necessary. If these are not lighted in you, your particular faculties will not benefit others in the least. The stars have not thought of this, they suppose that you and every other light must be a wax taper, but I must go down now." So he laid himself to rest. "Wax tapers, indeed," said the lamp, "I have never yet to these, nor is it likely I ever shall. If I could only be sure of not being melted down." The next day. Well, perhaps we had better pass over the next day. The evening had come, and the lamp was resting in a grandfather's chair, and guess where? Why, at the old watchman's house. He had begged, as a favor, that the mayor and corporation would allow him to keep the street lamp, in consideration of his long and faithful service, as he had himself hung it up and lit it on the day he first commenced his duties, 24 years ago. He looked upon it almost as his own child. He had no children, so the lamp was given to him. There it lay in a great armchair near to the warm stove. It seemed almost as if it had grown larger, for it appeared quite to fill the chair. The old people sat at their supper, casting friendly glances at the old lamp, whom they would willingly have admitted to a place at the table. It is quite true that they dwelt in a cellar, 2 yards deep in the earth, and they had to cross a stone passage to get to their room, but within it was warm and comfortable, and strips of list had been nailed round the door. The bed and the little window had curtains, and everything looked clean and neat. On the window seat stood 2 curious flower pots which a sailor, named Christian, had brought over from the East or West Indies. They were of clay, and in the form of 2 elephants, with open backs. They were hollow and filled with earth, and through the open space flowers bloomed. In one grew some very fine chives or leeks. This was the kitchen garden. The other elephant, which contained a beautiful geranium, they called their flower garden. On the wall hung a large colored print, representing the Congress of Vienna, and all the kings and emperors at once. A clock, with heavy weights, hung on the wall and went tick, tick, steadily enough, yet it was always rather too fast, which, however, the old people said was better than being too slow. They were now eating their supper, while the old street lamp, as we have heard, lay in the grandfather's armchair near the stove. It seemed to the lamp as if the whole world had turned round, but after a while the old watchman looked at the lamp, and spoke of what they had both gone through together, in rain and in fog, during the short bright nights of summer, or in a long winter nights, through the drifting snowstorms, when he longed to be at home in the cellar. Then the lamp felt it was all right again. He saw everything that had happened quite clearly, as if it were passing before him. Surely the wind had given him an excellent gift. The old people were very active and industrious. They were never idle for even a single hour. On Sunday afternoons they would bring out some books, generally a book of travels which they were very fond of. The old man would read aloud about Africa, with its great forests and the wild elephants, while his wife would listen attentively, stealing a glance now and then at the clay elephants, which served as flower pots. "I can almost imagine I am seeing it all," she said, and then how the lamp wished for a wax taper to be lighted in him, for then the old woman would have seen the smallest detail as clearly as he did himself. The lofty trees, with their thickly entwined branches, the naked negroes on horseback, and whole herds of elephants treading down bamboo thickets with their broad, heavy feet. "What is the use of all my capabilities," sighed the old lamp, "when I cannot obtain any wax lights? They have only oil and tallow here, and these will not do." One day a great heap of wax candle ends found their way into the cellar. The larger pieces were burnt, and the smaller ones the old woman kept for waxing her thread. So there were now candles enough, but it never occurred to anyone to put a little piece in the lamp. "Here I am now with my rare powers," thought the lamp. "I have faculties within me, but I cannot share them. They do not know that I could cover these white walls with beautiful tapestry, or change them into noble forests, or, indeed, to anything else they might wish for." The lamp, however, was always kept clean and shining in a corner where it attracted all eyes. Strangers looked upon it as lumber, but the old people did not care for that. They loved the lamp. One day it was the watchman's birthday. The old woman approached the lamp, smiling to herself, and said, I will have an illumination today in honor of my old man." And the lamp rattled in his metal frame, for he thought, "Now at last I shall have a light within me," but after all no wax light was placed in the lamp, but oil as usual. The lamp burned through the whole evening, and began to perceive too clearly that the gift of the stars would remain a hidden treasure all his life. Then he had a dream, for, to one with his faculties, dreaming was no difficulty. It appeared to him that the old people were dead, and that he had been taken to the iron foundry to be melted down. It caused him quite as much anxiety as on the day when he had been called upon to appear before the mayor and the council at the town hall. But though he had been endowed with the power of falling into decay from rust when he pleased, he did not make use of it. He was therefore put into the melting furnace and changed into as elegant an iron candlestick as you could wish to see, one intended to hold a wax taper. The candlestick was in the form of an angel holding a nosegay, in the center of which the wax taper was to be placed. It was to stand on a green writing table. In a very pleasant room, many books were scattered about, and splendid paintings hung on the walls. The owner of the room was a poet, and a man of intellect. Everything he thought or wrote was pictured around him. Nature showed herself to him sometimes in the dark forests, at others in cheerful meadows where the storks were strutting about, or on the deck of a ship sailing across the foaming sea with a clear, blue sky above, or at night the glittering stars. "What powers I possess," said the lamp. Awaking from his dream, "I could almost wish to be melted down, but no, that must not be while the old people live. They love me for myself alone, they keep me bright, and supply me with oil. I'm as well off as the picture of the Congress, in which they take so much pleasure." And from that time he felt at rest in himself, and not more so than such an honorable old lamp really deserved to be. Chapter 70 Olelu Koi, the Dream God. There is nobody in the world who knows so many stories as Olelu Koi, or who can relate them so nicely. In the evening, while the children are seated at the table or in their little chairs, he comes up the stairs very softly, for he walks in his socks. Then he opens the doors without the slightest noise, and throws a small quantity of very fine dust in their eyes, just enough to prevent them from keeping them open, and so they do not see him. Then he creeps behind them, and blows softly upon their necks, till their heads begin to droop. But Olelu Koi does not wish to hurt them, for he is very fond of children, and only wants them to be quiet that he may relate to them pretty stories, and they never are quiet until they are in bed and asleep. As soon as they are asleep, Olelu Koi seats himself upon the bed. He is nicely dressed, his coat is made of silken stuff, it is impossible to say of what color, for it changes from green to red, and from red to blue as he turns from side to side. Under each arm he carries an umbrella, one of them, with pictures on the inside, he spreads over the good children, and then they dream the most beautiful stories the whole night. But the other umbrella has no pictures, and this he holds over the naughty children so that they sleep heavily, and wake in the morning without having dreamed at all. Now we shall hear how Olelu Koi came every night during a whole week to the little boy named Hilma, and what he told him. There were 7 stories, as there are 7 days in the week. Monday. "Now pay attention," said Olelu Koi, in the evening, when Hilma was in bed, "and I will decorate the room." Immediately all the flowers in the flower pots became large trees, with long branches reaching to the ceiling, and stretching along the walls, so that the whole room was like a greenhouse. All the branches were loaded with flowers, each flower as beautiful and as fragrant as a rose, and, had anyone tasted them, he would have found them sweeter even than jam. The fruit glittered like gold, and there were cakes so full of plums that they were nearly bursting. It was incomparably beautiful. At the same time sounded dismal moans from the table drawer in which lay Hilma's school books. "What can that be now?" said Olelu Koi, going to the table and pulling out the drawer. It was a slate, in such distress because of a false number in the sum, that it had almost broken itself to pieces. The pencil pulled and tugged at its string as if it were a little dog that wanted to help, but could not. And then came a moan from Hilma's copybook. Oh, it was quite terrible to hear. On each leaf stood a row of capital letters, every one having a small letter by its side. This formed a copy. Under these were other letters, which Hilma had written. They fancied they looked like the copy, but they were mistaken, for they were leaning on one side as if they intended to fall over the pencil lines. "See, this is the way you should hold yourselves," said the copy. "Look here, you should slope thus, with a graceful curve." "Oh, we are very willing to do so, but we cannot," said Hilma's letters. "We are so wretchedly made. You must be scratched out." "Then," said Olelu Koi, "Oh, no," they cried, and then they stood up so gracefully it was quite a pleasure to look at them. "Now we must give up our stories, and exercise these letters," said Olalukoi. 1, 2, 1, 2. So he drilled them till they stood up gracefully, and looked as beautiful as a copy could look. But after Olalukoi was gone, and Hilma looked at them in the morning, they were as wretched and as awkward as ever. Tuesday. As soon as Hilma was in bed, Olalukoi touched, with his little magic wand, all the furniture in the room, which immediately began to chatter, and each article only talked of itself. Over the chest of drawers hung a large picture in a gilt frame, representing a landscape, with fine old trees, flowers in the grass, and a broad stream, which flowed through the wood, past several castles, far out into the wild ocean. Olalukoi touched the picture with his magic wand, and immediately the birds commenced singing, the branches of the trees rustled, and the clouds moved across the sky, casting their shadows on the landscape beneath them. Then Olalukoi lifted little Hilma up to the frame, and placed his feet in the picture, just on the high grass. And there he stood with the sun shining down upon him through the branches of the trees. He ran to the water, and seated himself in a little boat which lay there, and which was painted red and white. The sails glittered like silver, and 6 swans, each with a golden circlet round its neck, and a bright blue star on its forehead, drew the boat past the greenwood, where the trees talked of robbers and witches, and the flowers of beautiful little elves and fairies, whose histories the butterflies had related to them. Brilliant fish, with scales like silver and gold, swam after the boat, sometimes making a spring and splashing the water round them, while birds, red and blue, small and great, flew after him in 2 long lines. The gnats danced round them, and the cockchafers cried "Bews, bews." They all wanted to follow Hilma, and all had some story to tell him. It was a most pleasant sail. Sometimes the forests were thick and dark, sometimes like a beautiful garden, gay with sunshine and flowers. Then he passed great palaces of glass and of marble, and on the balconies stood princesses, whose faces were those of little girls whom Hilma knew well, and had often played with. One of them held out her hand, in which was a heart made of sugar, more beautiful than any confectioner ever sold. As Hilma sailed by, he caught hold of one side of the sugar heart, and held it fast, and the princess held fast also, so that it broke in 2 pieces. Hilma had one piece, and the princess the other, but Hilma's was the largest. At each castle stood little princes acting as sentinels. They presented arms, and had golden swords, and made it train plums and tin soldiers, so that they must have been real princes. Hilma continued to sail, sometimes through woods, sometimes as it were through large halls, and then by large cities. At last he came to the town where his nurse lived, who had carried him in her arms when he was a very little boy, and had always been kind to him. She nodded and beckoned to him, and then sang the little verses she had herself composed and said to him, "How oft my memory turns to thee, my own Hilma, ever dear, when I could watch thy infant glee, or kiss away a pearly tear, 'twas in my arms thy lisping tongue first spoke the half-remembered word, while o'er thy tottering steps I hung, my fond protection to afford. Farewell. I pray the heavenly power, to keep thee till thy dying hour." And all the birds sang the same tune, the flowers danced on their stems, and the old trees nodded as if Olalukoi had been telling them stories as well. Wednesday. How the rain did pour down. Hilma could hear it in his sleep. And when Olalukoi opened the window, the water flowed quite up to the windowsill. It had the appearance of a large lake outside, and a beautiful ship lay close to the house. "Wilt thou sail with me tonight, little Hilma?" said Olalukoi. "Then we shall see foreign countries, and thou shalt return here in the morning." All in a moment, there stood Hilma, in his best clothes, on the deck of the noble ship, and immediately the weather became fine. They sailed through the streets, round by the church, and on every side rolled the wide, great sea. They sailed till the land disappeared, and then they saw a flock of storks, who had left their own country, and were traveling to warmer climates. The storks flew one behind the other, and had already been a long, long time on the wing. One of them seemed so tired that his wings could scarcely carry him. He was the last of the row, and was soon left very far behind. At length he sunk lower and lower, with outstretched wings, flapping them in vain, till his feet touched the rigging of the ship, and he slided from the sails to the deck, and stood before them. Then a sailor boy caught him, and put him in the hen house, with the fowls, the ducks, and the turkeys, while the poor stork stood quite bewildered amongst them. "Just look at that fellow," said the chickens. Then the turkey cock puffed himself out as large as he could, and inquired who he was, and the duck swaddled backwards, crying, "Quack, quack." Then the stork told them all about warm Africa, of the pyramids, and of the ostrich, which, like a wild horse, runs across the desert. But the ducks did not understand what he said, and quacked amongst themselves. "We are all of the same opinion, namely, that he is stupid." "Yes, to be sure. He is stupid," said the turkey cock, and gobbled. Then the stork remained quite silent, and thought of his home in Africa. "Those are handsome thin legs of yours," said the turkey cock. "What do they cost a yard?" "Quack, quack, quack," grinned the ducks. But the stork pretended not to hear. "You may as well laugh," said the turkey, for that remark was rather witty, or perhaps it was above you. "R, is he not clever? He will be a great amusement to us while he remains here." And then he gobbled, and the ducks quacked, "Gobble, gobble, quack, quack." What a terrible uproar they made, while they were having such fun among themselves. Then Hilma went to the hen house, and, opening the door, called to the stork. Then he hopped out on the deck. He had rested himself now, and he looked happy, and seemed as if he nodded to Hilma, as if to thank him. Then he spread his wings, and flew away to warmer countries, while the hens clucked. The ducks quacked, and the turkey cock turned quite scarlet in the head. "Tomorrow you shall be made into soup," said Hilma to the fowls, and then he awoke, and found himself lying in his little bed. It was a wonderful journey which Olalukoi had made him take this night, Thursday. "What do you think I have got here?" said Olalukoi. "Do not be frightened, and you shall see a little mouse." And then he held out his hand to him, in which lay a lovely little creature. "It has come to invite you to a wedding. 2 little mice are going to enter into the marriage state tonight. They reside under the floor of your mother's storeroom, and that must be a fine dwelling place." "But how can I get through the little mouse hole in the floor?" asked Hilma. "Leave me to manage that," said Olalukoi. "I will soon make you small enough." And then he touched Hilma with his magic wand, whereupon he became less and less, until at last he was not longer than a little finger. "Now you can borrow the dress of the tin soldier. I think it will just fit you. It looks well to wear a uniform when you go into company." "Yes, certainly," said Hilma, and in a moment he was dressed as neatly as the neatest of all tin soldiers. "Will you be so good as to seat yourself in your mamma's thimble," said the little mouse, "that I may have the pleasure of drawing you to the wedding?" "Will you really take so much trouble, young lady?" said Hilma. And so in this way he rode to the mouse's wedding. First they went under the floor, and then passed through a long passage, which was scarcely high enough to allow the thimble to drive under, and the whole passage was lit up with the phosphorescent light of rotten wood. "Does it not smell delicious?" asked the mouse, as she drew him along. "The wall and the floor have been smeared with bacon rind, nothing can be nicer." Very soon they arrived at the bridal hall. On the right stood all the little lady mice, whispering and giggling, as if they were making game of each other. To the left were the gentlemen mice, stroking their whiskers with their forepaws, and in the center of the hall could be seen the bridal pair, standing side by side, in a hollow cheese rind, and kissing each other, while all eyes were upon them, for they had already been betrothed, and were soon to be married. More and more friends kept arriving, till the mice were nearly treading each other to death, for the bridal pair now stood in the doorway, and none could pass in or out. The room had been rubbed over with bacon rind, like the passage, which was all the refreshment offered to the guests. But for dessert they produced a pea, on which a mouse belonging to the bridal pair had bitten the first letters of their names. This was something quite uncommon. All the mice said it was a very beautiful wedding, and that they had been very agreeably entertained. After this, Hilma returned home. He had certainly been in grand society, but he had been obliged to creep under a room, and to make himself small enough to wear the uniform of a tin soldier. Friday. "It is incredible how many old people there are who would be glad to have me at night," said Olalukoi, "especially those who have done something wrong. Good little Ole, say they to me, we cannot close our eyes, and we lie awake the whole night and see all our evil deeds sitting on our beds like little imps, and sprinkling us with hot water. Will you come and drive them away, that we may have a good night's rest?" And then they sigh so deeply and say, "We would gladly pay you for it. Good night, Olaluk, the money lies on the window. But I never do anything for gold. What shall we do tonight?" asked Hilma. "I do not know whether you would care to go to another wedding," he replied, "although it is quite a different affair to the one we saw last night. Your sister's large doll, that is dressed like a man, and is called Herman, intends to marry the doll Bertha. It is also the doll's birthday, and they will receive many presents." "Yes, I know that already," said Hilma. "My sister always allows her dolls to keep their birthdays or to have a wedding when they require new clothes. That has happened already 100 times, I am quite sure." "Yes, so it may, but tonight is the 101st wedding, and when that has taken place it must be the last, therefore this is to be extremely beautiful. Only look. Chuma looked at the table, and there stood the little cardboard doll's house, with lights in all the windows, and drawn up before it were the tin soldiers presenting arms. The bridal pair was seated on the floor, leaning against the leg of the table, looking very thoughtful, and with good reason. Then Olelu Koi dressed up in grandmother's black gown married them. As soon as the ceremony was concluded, all the furniture in the room joined in singing a beautiful song, which had been composed by the lead pencil, and which went to the melody of a military tattoo. What merry sounds are on the wind! As marriage rites together bind, a quiet and a loving pair, though formed of good, yet smooth and fair, hurrah! If they are deaf and blind, we'll sing, though weather prove unkind. And now came the present, but the bridal pair had nothing to eat, for love was to be their food. Shall we go to a country house, or travel? Asked the bridegroom. Then they consulted the swallow who had travelled so far, and the old hen in the yard, who had brought up 5 broods of chickens. And the swallow talked to them of warm countries, where the grapes hang in large clusters on the vines, and the air is soft and mild, and about the mountains glowing with colours more beautiful than we can think of, but they have no red cabbage like we have, said the hen. I was once in the country with my chickens for a whole summer. There was a large sand pit, in which we could walk about and scratch as we liked. Then we got into a garden in which grew red cabbage. Oh, how nice it was! I cannot think of anything more delicious. But one cabbage stalk is exactly like another, said the swallow, and here we have often bad weather. Yes, but we are accustomed to it, said the hen, but it is so cold here, and freezes sometimes. Cold weather is good for cabbages, said the hen, besides we do have it warm here sometimes. 4 years ago, we had a summer that lasted more than 5 weeks, and it was so hot one could scarcely breathe. And then in this country we have no poisonous animals, and we are free from robbers. He must be wicked who does not consider our country the finest of all lands. He ought not to be allowed to live here. And then the hen wept very much and said, I have also travelled. I once went 12 miles in a coop, and it was not pleasant travelling at all. The hen is a sensible woman, said the doll Bertha. I don't care for travelling over mountains, just to go up and come down again. No, let us go to the sand pit in front of the gate, and then take a walk in the cabbage garden. And so they settled it. Saturday. Am I to hear any more stories? Asked little Hilma, as soon as Olelu Koi had sent him to sleep. We shall have no time this evening, said he, spreading out his prettiest umbrella over the child. Look at these Chinese, and then the whole umbrella appeared like a large china bowl, with blue trees and pointed bridges, upon which stood little Chinamen nodding their heads. We must make all the world beautiful for tomorrow morning, said Olelu Koi, for it will be a holiday. It is Sunday. I must now go to the church steeple and see if the little sprites who live there have polished the bells, so that they may sound sweetly. Then I must go into the fields and see if the wind has blown the dust from the grass and the leaves, and the most difficult task of all which I have to do, is to take down all the stars and brighten them up. I have to number them first before I put them in my apron, and also to number the places from which I take them, so that they may go back into the right holes, or else they would not remain, and we should have a number of falling stars, for they would all tumble down one after the other. Hark ye. Mr. Liu Koi, said an old portrait which hung on the wall of Hilma's bedroom. Do you know me? I am Hilma's great-grandfather. I thank you for telling the boy stories, but you must not confuse his ideas. The stars cannot be taken down from the sky and polished. They are spheres like our earth, which is a good thing for them. Thank you, old great-grandfather, said Olelu Koi. I thank you. You may be the head of the family, as no doubt you are, but I am older than you. I am an ancient teen. The old Romans and Greeks named me the dream god. I have visited the noblest houses, and continued to do so. Still I know how to conduct myself both to high and low, and now you may tell the stories yourself. And so Olelu Koi walked off, taking his umbrellas with him. Well, one is never to give an opinion, I suppose, grumbled the portrait. And it woke Hilma. Sunday. Good evening, said Olelu Koi. Hilma nodded, and then sprang out of bed, and turned his great-grandfather's portrait to the wall, so that it might not interrupt them as it had done yesterday. Now, said he, you must tell me some stories about 5 green peas that lived in one pod, or of the chickseed that courted the chickweed, or of the darning needle, who acted so proudly because she fancied herself an embroidery needle. You may have too much of a good thing, said Olelu Koi. You know that I like best to show you something, so I will show you my brother. He is also called Olelu Koi, but he never visits anyone but once, and when he does come, he takes him away on his horse, and tells him stories as they ride along. He knows only 2 stories. One of these is so wonderfully beautiful, that no one in the world can imagine anything at all like it, but the other is just as ugly and frightful, so that it would be impossible to describe it. Then Olalukoi lifted Hilma up to the window. There now, you can see my brother, the other Olalukoi. He is also called Death. You perceive he is not so bad as they represent him in picture books. There he is a skeleton, but now his coat is embroidered with silver, and he wears the splendid uniform of a hussar, and a mantle of black velvet flies behind him, over the horse. Look, how he gallops along. Hilma saw that as this Olalukoi rode on, he lifted up old and young, and carried them away on his horse. Some he seated in front of him, and some behind, but always inquired first, how stands the mark book? Good, they all answered, yes, but let me see for myself, he replied, and they were obliged to give him the books. Then all those who had very good, or exceedingly good, came in front of the horse, and heard the beautiful story, while those who had middling, or tolerably good, in their books, were obliged to sit behind, and listen to the frightful tale. They trembled and cried, and wanted to jump down from the horse, but they could not get free, for they seemed fastened to the seat. Why, Death is a most splendid Lukoi, said Hilma. I am not in the least afraid of him. You need have no fear of him, said Olalukoi, if you take care and keep a good conduct book. Now I call that very instructive, murmured the great-grandfather's portrait. It is useful sometime to express an opinion, so he was quite satisfied. These are some of the doings and sayings of Olalukoi. I hope he may visit you himself this evening, and relate some more. Chapter 71. Our aunt. You ought to have known our aunt, she was charming. That is to say, she was not charming at all as the word is usually understood, but she was good and kind, amusing in her way, and was just as anyone ought to be whom people are to talk about and to laugh at. She might have been put into a play, and wholly and solely on account of the fact that she only lived for the theatre and for what was done there. She was an honourable matron, but Agent Fabs, whom she used to call Flabs, declared that our aunt was stage-struck. The theatre is my school, said she, the source of my knowledge. From thence I have resuscitated biblical history. Now, Moses and Joseph in Egypt, there are operas for you. I get my universal history from the theatre, my geography, and my knowledge of men. Out of the French pieces I get to know life in Paris, slippery, but exceedingly interesting. How I have cried over La Famille Roquebug that the man must drink himself to death, so that she may marry the young fellow. Yes, how many tears I have wept in the 50 years I have subscribed to the theatre. Our aunt knew every acting play, every bit of scenery, every character, everyone who appeared or had appeared. She seemed really only to live during the 9 months the theatre was open. Summertime without a summer theatre seemed to be only a time that made her old, while, on the other hand, a theatrical evening that lasted till midnight was a lengthening of her life. She did not say, as other people do, now we shall have spring, the stork is here, or, they've advertised the first strawberries in the papers. She, on the contrary, used to announce the coming of autumn, with have you heard they're selling boxes for the theatre? Now the performances will begin. She used to value a lodging entirely according to its proximity to the theatre. It was a real sorrow to her when she had to leave the little lane behind the playhouse, and move into the great street that lay a little farther off, and live there in a house where she had no opposite neighbors. At home, said she, my windows must be my opera box. One cannot sit and look into oneself till one's tired, one must see people. But now I live just as if I'd go into the country. If I want to see human beings, I must go into my kitchen, and sit down on the sink, for there only I have opposite neighbors. No, when I lived in my dear little lane, I could look straight down into the ironmonger's shop, and had only 300 paces to the theatre, and now I've 3,000 paces to go, military measurement. Our aunt was sometimes ill, but however unwell she might feel, she never missed the play. The doctor prescribed one day that she should put her feet in a bran bath, and she followed his advice, but she drove to the theatre all the same, and sat with her feet in bran there. If she had died there, she would have been very glad. Thorwaldsen died in the theatre, and she called that a happy death. She could not imagine but that in heaven there must be a theatre too. It had not, indeed, been promised us, but we might very well imagine it. The many distinguished actors and actresses who had passed away must surely have a field for their talent. Our aunt had an electric wire from the theatre to her room. A telegram used to be dispatched to her at coffee time, and it used to consist of the words, Herr Savitsen is at the machinery, for it was he who gave the signal for drawing the curtain up and down and for changing the scenes. From him she used to receive a short and concise description of every piece. His opinion of Shakespeare's Tempest was mad nonsense. There's so much to put up, and the first scene begins with water to the front of the wings. That is to say, the water had to come forward so far. But when, on the other hand, the same interior scene remained through 5 acts, he used to pronounce it a sensible, well-written play, a resting play, which performed itself, without putting up scenes. In earlier times, by which name our aunt used to designate 30 years ago, she and the before-mentioned Herr Savitson had been younger. At that time he had already been connected with the machinery, and was, as she said, her benefactor. It used to be the custom in those days that in the evening performances in the only theatre the town possessed, spectators were admitted to the part called the flies, over the stage, and every machinist had 1 or 2 places to give away. Often the flies were quite full of good company. It was said that generals' wives and privy councillors' wives had been up there. It was quite interesting to look down behind the scenes, and to see how the people walked to and fro on the stage when the curtain was down. Our aunt had been there several times, as well when there was a tragedy as when there was a ballet, for the pieces in which there were the greatest number of characters on the stage were the most interesting to see from the flies. One sat pretty much in the dark up there, and most people took their supper up with them. Once 3 apples and a great piece of bread and butter and sausage fell down right into the dungeon of Ugolino, where that unhappy man was to be starved to death, and there was great laughter among the audience. The sausage was one of the weightiest reasons why the worthy management refused in future to have any spectators up in the flies. But I was there 37 times, said our aunt, and I shall always remember Mr. Sivert for that. On the very last evening when the flies were still open to the public, the Judgment of Solomon was performed, as our aunt remembered very well. She had, through the influence of her benefactor, Herr Sivert, procured a free admission for the agent Fabs, although he did not deserve it in the least, for he was always cutting his jokes about the theatre and teasing our aunt, but she had procured him a free admission to the flies, for all that. He wanted to look at this player stuff from the other side. Those were his own words, and they were just like him, said our aunt. He looked down from above on the Judgment of Solomon, and fell asleep over it. One would have thought that he had come from a dinner where many toasts had been given. He went to sleep, and was locked in. And there he sat through the dark night in the flies, and when he woke, he told a story, but our aunt would not believe it. The Judgment of Solomon was over, he said, and all the people had gone away, upstairs and downstairs, but now the real play began, the afterpiece, which was the best of all, said the agent. Then life came into the affair. It was not the Judgment of Solomon that was performed, no, a real court of judgment was held upon the stage. And Agent Fabs had the impudence to try and make our aunt believe all this. That was the thanks she got for having got him a place in the flies. What did the agent say? Why, it was curious enough to hear, but there was malice and satire in it. It looked dark enough up there, said the agent. But then the magic business began, a great performance, the judgment in the theatre. The box keepers were at their posts, and every spectator had to show his ghostly passbook, that it might be decided if he was to be admitted with hands loose or bound, and with or without a muzzle. Grand people who came too late, when the performance had begun, and young people, who could not always watch the time, were tied up outside, and had list slippers put on their feet, with which they were allowed to go in before the beginning of the next act, and they had muscles too. And then the judgment on the stage began. All malice, and not a bit of truth in it, said our aunt. The painter, who wanted to get to paradise, had to go up a staircase which he had himself painted, but which no man could mount. That was to expiate his sins against perspective. All the plants and buildings, which the property man had placed, with infinite pains, in countries to which they did not belong, the poor fellow was obliged to put in their right places before cockcrow, if he wanted to get into paradise. Let Herr Fab see how he would get in himself, but what he said of the performers, tragedians and comedians, singers and dancers, that it was the most rascally of all. Mr. Fabs. Indeed! Flabs. He did not deserve to be admitted at all, and our aunt would not soil her lips with what he said. And he said, did Flabs, that the whole was written down, and it should be printed when he was dead and buried, but not before, for he would not risk having his arms and legs broken. Once our aunt had been in fear and trembling in her temple of happiness, the theatre. It was on a winter day, one of those days in which one has a couple of hours of daylight, with a grey sky. It was terribly cold and snowy, but aunt must go to the theatre. A little opera and a great ballet were performed, and a prologue and an epilogue into the bargain, and that would last till late at night. Our aunt must needs go, so she borrowed a pair of fur boots of her lodger boots with fur inside and out, and which reached far up her legs. She got to the theatre, and to her box. The boots were warm, and she kept them on. suddenly there was a cry of fire. Smoke was coming from one of the side scenes, and streamed down from the flies, and there was a terrible panic. The people came rushing out, and our aunt was the last in the box, on the second tier, left-hand side, for from the scenery looks best, she used to say. The scenes are always arranged that they look best from the king's side. Aunt wanted to come out, but the people before her, in their fright and heedlessness, slammed the door of the box, and sat our aunt, and couldn't get out, and couldn't get in, that is to say, she couldn't get into the next box, for the partition was too high for her. She called out, and no one heard her. She looked down into the tier of boxes below her, and it was empty, and low, and looked quite near, and Aunt in her terror felt quite young and light. She thought of jumping down, and had got one leg over the partition, the other resting on the bench. She sat astride, as if on horseback, well wrapped up in her flowered cloak with one leg hanging out, a leg in a tremendous fur boot. That was a sight to behold, and when it was beheld, our aunt was heard too, and was saved from burning, for the theatre was not burned down. That was the most memorable evening of her life, and she was glad that she could not see herself, for she would have died with confusion. Her benefactor in the machinery department, Herr Savitson, visited her every Sunday, but it was a long time from Sunday to Sunday. In the latter time, therefore, she used to have in a little child for the scraps, that is to say, to eat up the remains of the dinner. It was a child employed in the ballet, one that certainly wanted feeding. The little one used to appear, sometimes as an elf, sometimes as a page. The most difficult part she had to play was the lion's hind leg in the magic flute, but as she grew larger she could represent the 4 feet of the lion. She certainly only got half a guilder for that, whereas the hind legs were paid for with a whole guilder, but then she had to walk bent, and to do without fresh air. That was all very interesting to hear, said our aunt. She deserved to live as long as the theatre stood, but she could not last so long, and she did not die in the theatre, but respectably in her bed. Her last words were, moreover, not without meaning. She asked, "What will the play be tomorrow?" At her death she left about $500. We presume this from the interest, which came to $20. This our aunt had destined as a legacy for a worthy old spinster who had no friends. It was to be devoted to a yearly subscription for a place in the second tier, on the left side, for the Saturday evening, for on that evening 2 pieces were always given, it said in the will, and the only condition laid upon the person who enjoyed the legacy was, that she should think, every Saturday evening, of our aunt, who was lying in her grave. This was our aunt's religion. Chapter 72 The Philosopher's Stone. Far away towards the east, in India, which seemed in those days the world's end, stood the tree of the sun, a noble tree, such as we have never seen, and perhaps never may see. The summit of this tree spread itself for miles like an entire forest, each of its smaller branches forming a complete tree. Palms, beech trees, pines, plane trees, and various other kinds, which are found in all parts of the world, were here like small branches, shooting forth from the great tree, while the larger boughs, with their knots and curves, formed valleys and hills, clothed with velvety green and covered with flowers. Everywhere it was like a blooming meadow or a lovely garden. Here were birds from all quarters of the world assembled together, birds from the primeval forests of America, from the rose gardens of Damascus, and from the deserts of Africa, in which the elephant and the lion may boast of being the only rulers. Birds from the polar regions came flying here, and of course the stork and the swallow were not absent. But the birds were not the only living creatures. There were stags, squirrels, antelopes, and hundreds of other beautiful and light-footed animals here found a home. The summit of the tree was a wide-spreading garden, and in the midst of it, where the green boughs formed a kind of hill, stood a castle of crystal, with a view from it towards every quarter of heaven. Each tower was erected in the form of a lily, and within the stern was a winding staircase, through which one could ascend to the top and step out upon the leaves as upon balconies. The calyx of the flower itself formed a most beautiful, glittering, circular hall, above which no other roof arose than the blue firmament and the sun and stars. Just as much splendor, but of another kind, appeared below, in the wide halls of the castle. Here, on the walls, were reflected pictures of the world, which represented numerous and varied scenes of everything that took place daily, so that it was useless to read the newspapers, and indeed there were none to be obtained in this spot. All was to be seen in living pictures by those who wished it, but all would have been too much for even the wisest man, and this man dwelt here. His name is very difficult, you would not be able to pronounce it, so it may be omitted. He knew everything that a man on earth can know or imagine. Every invention already in existence or yet to be, was known to him, and much more. Still everything on earth has a limit. The wise King Solomon was not half so wise as this man. He could govern the powers of nature and held sway over potent spirits. Even death itself was obliged to give him every morning a list of those who were to die during the day. And King Solomon himself had to die at last, and this fact it was which so often occupied the thoughts of this great man in the castle on the tree of the Sunday. He knew that he also, however high he might tower above other men in wisdom, must one day die. He knew that his children would fade away like the leaves of the forest and become dust. He saw the human race wither and fall like leaves from the tree. He saw new men come to fill their places, but the leaves that fell off never sprouted forth again, they crumbled to dust or were absorbed into other plants. What happens to man, asked the wise man of himself, when touched by the angel of death? What can death be? The body decays, and the soul. Yes, what is the soul, and whither does it go? To eternal life, says the comforting voice of religion. But what is this change? Where and how shall we exist? Above, in heaven, answers the pious man, it is there we hope to go. Above, repeated the wise man, fixing his eyes upon the moon and stars above him. He saw that this earthly sphere above and below were constantly changing places, and that the position varied according to the spot on which a man found himself. He knew, also, that even if he ascended to the top of the highest mountain which rears its lofty summit on this earth, the air, which to us seems clear and transparent, would be dark and cloudy, the sun would have a coppery glow and send forth no rays, and our earth would lie beneath him wrapped in an orange-colored mist. How narrow are the limits which confine the bodily sight, and how little can be seen by the eye of the soul. How little do the wisest among us know of that which is so important to us all. In the most secret chamber of the castle lay the greatest treasure on earth, the Book of Truth. The wise man had read it through page after page. Every man may read in this book, but only in fragments. To many eyes the characters seem so mixed in confusion that the words cannot be distinguished. On certain pages the writing often appears so pale or so blurred that the page becomes a blank. The wiser a man becomes, the more he will read, and those who are wisest read most. The wise man knew how to unite the sunlight and the moonlight with the light of reason and the hidden powers of nature, and through the stronger light, many things in the pages were made clear to him. But in the portion of the book entitled Life After Death not a single point could he see distinctly. This pained him. Should he never be able here on earth to obtain a light by which everything written in the Book of Truth should become clear to him? Like the wise King Solomon, he understood the language of animals, and could interpret their talk into song, but that made him none the wiser. He found out the nature of plants and metals, and their power in curing diseases and arresting death, but none to destroy death itself. In all created things within his reach he sought the light that should shine upon the certainty of an eternal life, but he found it not. The Book of Truth lay open before him, but its pages were to him as blank paper. Christianity placed before him in the Bible a promise of eternal life, but he wanted to read it in his book, in which nothing on the subject appeared to be written. He had 5 children, 4 sons, educated as the children of such a wise father should be, and a daughter, fair, gentle, and intelligent, but she was blind. Yet this deprivation appeared as nothing to her. Her father and brothers were outward eyes to her, and a vivid imagination made everything clear to her mental sight. The sons had never gone further from the castle than the branches of the trees extended, and the sister had scarcely ever left home. They were happy children in that home of their childhood, the beautiful and fragrant tree of the Sunday like all children. They loved to hear stories related to them, and their father told them many things which other children would not have understood, but these were as clever as most grown-up people are among us. He explained to them what they saw in the pictures of life on the castle walls, the doings of man, and the progress of events in all the lands of the earth, and the sons often expressed a wish that they could be present, and take a part in these great deeds. Then their father told them that in the world there was nothing but toil and difficulty, that it was not quite what it appeared to them, as they looked upon it in their beautiful home. He spoke to them of the true, the beautiful, and the good, and told them that these 3 held together in the world, and by that union they became crystallized into a precious jewel, clearer than a diamond of the first water-ray jewel, whose splendor had a value even in the sight of God, in whose brightness all things are dim. This jewel was called the Philosopher's Stone. He told them that, by searching, man could attain to a knowledge of the existence of God, and that it was in the power of every man to discover the certainty that such a jewel as the Philosopher's Stone really existed. This information would have been beyond the perception of other children, but these children understood, and others will learn to comprehend its meaning after a time. They questioned their father about the true, the beautiful, and the good, and he explained it to them in many ways. He told them that God, when he made man out of the dust of the earth, touched his work 5 times, leaving 5 intense feelings, which we call the 5 senses. Through these, the true, the beautiful, and the good are seen, understood, and perceived, and through these they are valued, protected, and encouraged. 5 senses have been given mentally and corporeally, inwardly and outwardly, to body and soul. The children thought deeply on all these things, and meditated upon them day and night. Then the eldest of the brothers dreamt a splendid dream. Strange to say, not only the second brother but also the third and fourth brothers all dreamt exactly the same thing, namely, that each went out into the world to find the philosopher's stone. Each dreamt that he found it, and that, as he rode back on his swift horse, in the morning dawn, over the velvety green meadows, to his home in the castle of his father, that the stone gleamed from his forehead like a beaming light, and threw such a bright radiance upon the pages of the book of truth that every word was illuminated which spoke of the life beyond the grave. But the sister had no dream of going out into the wide world, it never entered her mind. Her world was her father's house. "I shall ride forth into the wide world," said the eldest brother. "I must try what life is like there, as I mix with men. I will practice only the good and true, with these I will protect the beautiful. Much shall be changed for the better while I am there." Now these thoughts were great and daring, as our thoughts generally are at home, before we have gone out into the world, and encountered its storms and tempests, its thorns and its thistles. In him, and in all his brothers, the 5 senses were highly cultivated, inwardly and outwardly, but each of them had one sense which in keenness and development surpassed the other 4. In the case of the eldest, this preeminent sense was sight, which he hoped would be of special service. He had eyes for all times and all people, eyes that could discover in the depths of the earth hidden treasures, and look into the hearts of men, as through a pane of glass. He could read more than is often seen on the cheek that blushes or grows pale, in the eye that droops or smiles. Stags and antelopes accompanied him to the western boundary of his home, and there he found the wild swans. These he followed, and found himself far away in the north, far from the land of his father, which extended eastward to the ends of the earth. How he opened his eyes with astonishment! How many things were to be seen here, and so different to the mere representation of pictures such as those in his father's house. At first he nearly lost his eyes in astonishment at the rubbish and mockery brought forward to represent the beautiful, but he kept his eyes, and soon found full employment for them. He wished to go thoroughly and honestly to work in his endeavor to understand the true, the beautiful, and the good. But how were they represented in the world? He observed that the wreath which rightly belonged to the beautiful was often given the hideous, that the good was often passed by unnoticed, while mediocrity was applauded, when it should have been hissed. People look at the dress, not at the wearer, thought more of a name than of doing their duty, and trusted more to reputation than to real service. It was everywhere the same. "I see I must make a regular attack on these things," said he, and he accordingly did not spare them. But while looking for the truth, came the evil one, the father of lies, to intercept him. Gladly would the fiend have plucked out the eyes of this seer, but that would have been a too straightforward path for him. He works more cunningly. He allowed the young man to seek for, and discover, the beautiful and the good, but while he was contemplating them, the evil spirit blew one mote after another into each of his eyes, and such a proceeding would injure the strongest sight. Then he blew upon the motes, and they became beams, so that the clearness of his sight was gone, and the seer was like a blind man in the world, and had no longer any faith in it. He had lost his good opinion of the world, as well as of himself, and when a man gives up the world, and himself too, it is all over with him. "All over," said the wild swan, who flew across the sea to the east. "All over," twittered the swallows, who were also flying eastward towards the tree of the Sunday. It was no good news which they carried home. "I think the seer has been badly served," said the second brother, "but the hearer may be more successful." This one possessed the sense of hearing to a very high degree, so acute was this sense, that it was said he could hear the grass grow. He took a fond leave of all at home, and rode away, provided with good abilities and good intentions. The swallows escorted him, and he followed the swans till he found himself out in the world, and far away from home. But he soon discovered that one may have too much of a good thing. His hearing was too fine. He not only heard the grass grow, but could hear every man's heart beat, whether in sorrow or in joy. The whole world was to him like a clockmaker's great workshop, in which all the clocks were going tick, tick, and all the turret clocks striking ding, dong. It was unbearable. For a long time his ears endured it, but at last all the noise and tumult became too much for one man to bear. There were rascally boys of 60 years old. For years do not alone make a man who raised a tumult, which might have made the hearer laugh, but for the applause which followed, echoing through every street and house, and was even heard in country roads. Falsehood thrust itself forward and played the hypocrite. The bells on the fool's cap jingled, and declared they were church bells, and the noise became so bad for the hearer that he thrust his fingers into his ears. Still, he could hear false notes and bad singing, gossip and idle words, scandal and slander, groaning and moaning, without and within. Heaven help us! He thrust his fingers further and further into his ears, till at last the drums burst. And now he could hear nothing more of the true, the beautiful, and the good, for his hearing was to have been the means by which he hoped to acquire his knowledge. He became silent and suspicious, and at last trusted no one, not even himself, and no longer hoping to find and bring home the costly jewel. He gave it up, and gave himself up too, which was worse than all. The birds in their flight towards the east, carried the tidings, and the news reached the castle in the tree of a Sunday. "I will try now," said the third brother, "I have a keen nose." Now that was not a very elegant expression, but it was his way, and we must take him as he was. He had a cheerful temper, and was, besides, a real poet. He could make many things appear poetical, by the way in which he spoke of them, and ideas struck him long before they occurred to the minds of others. "I can smell," he would say, and he attributed to the sense of smelling, which he possessed in a high degree, a great power in the region of the beautiful. "I can smell," he would say, and many places are fragrant or beautiful according to the taste of the frequenters. One man feels at home in the atmosphere of the tavern, among the flaring tallow candles, and when the smell of spirits mingles with the fumes of bad tobacco. Another prefers sitting amidst the overpowering scent of jasmine, or perfuming himself with scented olive oil. This man seeks the fresh sea breeze, while that one climbs the lofty mountain top, to look down upon the busy life in miniature beneath him. As he spoke in this way, it seemed as if he had already been out in the world, as if he had already known and associated with man. But this experience was intuitive. It was the poetry within him, a gift from heaven bestowed on him in his cradle. He bade farewell to his parental roof in the tree of the sun, and departed on foot, from the pleasant scenes that surrounded his home. Arrived at its confines, he mounted on the back of an ostrich, which runs faster than a horse, and afterwards, when he fell in with the wild swans, he swung himself on the strongest of them, for he loved change, and away he flew over the sea to distant lands, where there were great forests, deep lakes, lofty mountains, and proud cities. Wherever he came it seemed as if sunshine traveled with him across the fields, for every flower, every bush, exhaled a renewed fragrance, as if conscious that a friend and protector was near, one who understood them, and knew their value. The stunted rosebush shot forth twigs, unfolded its leaves, and bore the most beautiful roses. Everyone could see it, and even the black, slimy wood snail noticed its beauty. "I will give my seal to the flower," said the snail, "I have trailed my slime upon it, I can do no more." "Thus it always fares with the beautiful in this world," said the poet. And he made a song upon it, and sung it after his own fashion, but nobody listened. Then he gave a drummer twopence and a peacock's feather, and composed a song for the drum, and the drummer beat it through the streets of the town, and when the people heard it they said, "That is a capital tune." The poet wrote many songs about the true, the beautiful, and the good. His songs were listened to in the tavern, where the tallow candles flared, in the fresh clover field, in the forest, and on the high seas, and it appeared as if this brother was to be more fortunate than the other two. But the evil spirit was angry at this, so he set to work with soot and incense, which he can mix so artfully as to confuse an angel, and how much more easily a poor poet. The evil one knew how to manage such people. He so completely surrounded the poet with incense that the man lost his head, forgot his mission and his home, and at last lost himself and vanished in smoke. But when the little birds heard of it, they mourned, and for 3 days they sang not one song. The black wood snail became blacker still, not for grief, but for envy. "They should have offered me incense," he said, "for it was I who gave him the idea of the most famous of his songs, the drum song of the way of the world, and it was I who spat at the rose. I can bring a witness to that fact." But no tidings of all this reached the poet's home in India. The birds had all been silent for 3 days, and when the time of mourning was over, so deep had been their grief, that they had forgotten for whom they wept. Such is the way of the world. "Now I must go out into the world, and disappear like the rest," said the fourth brother. He was as good-tempered as the third, but no poet, though he could be witty. The 2 eldest had filled the castle with joyfulness, and now the last brightness was going away. Sight and hearing have always been considered 2 of the chief senses among men, and those which they wish to keep bright. The other senses are looked upon as of less importance. But the younger son had a different opinion. He had cultivated his taste in every way, and taste is very powerful. It rules over what goes into the mouth, as well as over all which is presented to the mind, and, consequently, this brother took upon himself to taste everything stored up in bottles or jars. This he called the rough part of his work. Every man's mind was to him as a vessel in which something was concocting, every land a kind of mental kitchen. There are no delicacies here, he said, so he wished to go out into the world to find something delicate to suit his taste. Perhaps fortune may be more favorable to me than it was to my brothers. I shall start on my travels, but what conveyance shall I choose? Are air balloons invented yet? He asked of his father, who knew of all inventions that had been made, or would be made. Air balloons had not then been invented, nor steamships, nor railways. Good, said he, then I shall choose an air balloon. My father knows how they are to be made and guided. Nobody has invented one yet, and the people will believe that it is an aerial phantom. When I have done with a balloon I shall burn it, and for this purpose, you must give me a few pieces of another invention, which will come next, I mean a few chemical matches. He obtained what he wanted, and flew away. The birds accompanied him farther than they had the other brothers. They were curious to know how this flight would end. Many more of them came swooping down. They thought it must be some new bird, and he soon had a goodly company of followers. They came in clouds till the air became darkened with birds as it was with a cloud of locusts over the land of Egypt. And now he was out in the wide world. The balloon descended over one of the greatest cities, and the aeronaut took up his station at the highest point, on the church steeple. The balloon rose again into the air, which it ought not to have done. What became of it is not known, neither is it of any consequence, for balloons had not then been invented. There he sat on the church steeple. The birds no longer hovered over him, they had got tired of him, and he was tired of them. All the chimneys in the town were smoking. There are altars erected to my honor, said the wind, who wished to say something agreeable to him as he sat there boldly looking down upon the people in the street. There was one stepping along, proud of his purse, another, of the key he carried behind him, though he had nothing to lock up, another took a pride in his moth-eaten coat, and another, in his mortified body. Vanity, all vanity! He exclaimed. I must go down the by and by, and touch and taste, but I shall sit here a little while longer, for the wind blows pleasantly at my back. I shall remain here as long as the wind blows, and enjoy a little rest. It is comfortable to sleep late in the morning when one had a great deal to do, said the sluggard, so I shall stop here as long as the wind blows, for it pleases me. And there he stayed. But as he was sitting on the weathercock of the steeple, which kept turning round and round with him, he was under the false impression that the same wind still blew, and that he could stay where he was without expense. But in India, in the castle on the tree of the sun, all was solitary and still, since the brothers had gone away one after the other. Nothing goes well with them, said the father. They will never bring the glittering jewel home, it is not made for me, they are all dead and gone. Then he bent down over the book of truth, and gazed on the page on which he should have read of the life after death, but for him there was nothing to be read or learned upon it. His blind daughter was his consolation and joy, she clung to him with sincere affection, and for the sake of his happiness and peace she wished the costly jewel could be found and brought home. With longing tenderness she thought of her brothers. Where were they? Where did they live? How she wished she might dream of them, but it was strange that not even in dreams could she be brought near to them. But at last one night she dreamt that she heard the voices of her brothers calling to her from the distant world, and she could not refrain herself, but went out to them, and yet it seemed in her dream that she still remained in her father's house. She did not see her brothers, but she felt as it were a fire burning in her hand, which, however, did not hurt her, for it was the jewel she was bringing to her father. When she awoke she thought for a moment that she still held the stone, but she only grasped the knob of her distaff. During the long evenings she had spun constantly, and round the distaff were woven threads finer than the web of a spider. Human eyes could never have distinguished these threads when separated from each other. But she had wetted them with her tears, and the twist was as strong as a cable. She rose with the impression that her dream must be a reality, and her resolution was taken. It was still night, and her father slept. She pressed a kiss upon his hand, and then took her distaff and fastened the end of the thread to her father's house. But for this, blind as she was, she would never have found her way home again. To this thread she must hold fast, and trust not to others or even to herself. From the tree of the sun she broke 4 leaves, which she gave up to the wind and the weather, that they might be carried to her brothers as letters and a greeting, in case she did not meet them in the wide world. Poor blind child, what would become of her in those distant regions? But she had the invisible thread, to which she could hold fast, and she possessed a gift which all the others lacked. This was a determination to throw herself entirely into whatever she undertook, and it made her feel as if she had eyes even at the tips of her fingers, and could hear down into her very heart. Quietly she went forth into the noisy, bustling, wonderful world, and wherever she went the skies grew bright, and she felt the warm sunbeam, and a rainbow above in the blue heavens seemed to span the dark world. She heard the song of the birds, and smelt the scent of the orange groves and apple orchards so strongly that she seemed to taste it. Soft tones and charming songs reached her ear, as well as harsh sounds and rough words, thoughts and opinions in strange contradiction to each other. Into the deepest recesses of her heart penetrated the echoes of human thoughts and feelings. Now she heard the following words sadly sung, "Life is a shadow that flits away, in a night of darkness and woe, but then would follow brighter thoughts. Life has the rose's sweet perfume, with sunshine, light, and joy, and if one stanza sounded painfully, each mortal thinks of himself alone, is a truth, alas, too clearly known." Then, on the other hand, came the answer, "Love, like a mighty flowing stream, fills every heart with its radiant gleam." She heard, indeed, such words as these, in the pretty turmoil here below. "All is a vain and paltry show." Then came also words of comfort, "Great and good are the actions done, by many whose worth is never known." And if sometimes the mocking strain reached her, why not join in the jesting cry, that contemns all gifts from the throne on high? In the blind girl's heart a stronger voice repeated, "To trust in thyself and God is best. In his holy will forever to rest." But the evil spirit could not see this and remain contented. He has more cleverness than 10,000 men, and he found means to compass his end. He betook himself to the marsh, and collected a few little bubbles of stagnant water. Then he uttered over them the echoes of lying words that they might become strong. He mixed up together songs of praise with lying epitaphs, as many as he could find, boiled them in tears shed by envy, put upon them rouge, which he had scraped from faded cheeks, and from these he produced a maiden, in form and appearance like the blind girl, the angel of completeness, as men called her. The evil one's plot was successful. The world knew not which was the true, and indeed how should the world know? To trust in thyself and God is best. In his holy will forever to rest. So sang the blind girl in full faith. She had entrusted the 4 green leaves from the tree of the sun to the winds, as letters of greeting to her brothers, and she had full confidence that the leaves would reach them. She fully believed that the jewel which outshines all the glories of the world would yet be found, and that upon the forehead of humanity it would glitter even in the castle of her father. "Even in my father's house," she repeated. "Yes, the place in which this jewel is to be found is earth, and I shall bring more than the promise of it with me. I feel it glow and swell more and more in my closed hand. Every grain of truth which the keen wind carried up and whirled towards me I caught and treasured. I allowed it to be penetrated with the fragrance of the beautiful, of which there is so much in the world, even for the blind. I took the beatings of a heart engaged in a good action, and added them to my treasure. All that I can bring is but dust, still, it is a part of the jewel we seek, and there is plenty, my hand is quite full of it." She soon found herself again at home, carried thither in a flight of thought, never having loosened her hold of the invisible thread fastened to her father's house. As she stretched out her hand to her father, the powers of evil dashed with the fury of a hurricane over the tree of the sun. A blast of wind rushed through the open doors, and into the sanctuary, where lay the book of truth. "It will be blown to dust by the wind," said the father, as he seized the open hand she held towards him. "No," she replied, with quiet confidence, "it is indestructible. I feel its beam warming my very soul." Then her father observed that a dazzling flame gleamed from the white page on which the shining dust had passed from her hand. It was there to prove the certainty of eternal life, and on the book glowed one shining word, and only one, the word believe. And soon the 4 brothers were again with the father and daughter. When the green leaf from home fell on the bosom of each, a longing had seized them to return. They had arrived, accompanied by the birds of passage, the stag, the antelope, and all the creatures of the forest who wished to take part in their joy. We have often seen, when a sunbeam burst through a crack in the door into a dusty room, how a whirling column of dust seems to circle round. But this was not poor, insignificant, common dust, which the blind girl had brought. Even the rainbow's colors are dim when compared with the beauty which shone from the page on which it had fallen. The beaming word believe, from every grain of truth, had the brightness of the beautiful and the good, more bright than the mighty pillar of flame that led Moses and the children of Israel to the land of Canaan, and from the word believe rose the bridge of hope, reaching even to the unmeasurable love in the realms of the infinite. Chapter 73 The Garden of Paradise. There was once a king's son who had a larger and more beautiful collection of books than anyone else in the world, and full of splendid copperplate engravings. He could read and obtain information respecting every people of every land, but not a word could he find to explain the situation of the Garden of Paradise, and this was just what he most wished to know. His grandmother had told him when he was quite a little boy, just old enough to go to school, that each flower in the Garden of Paradise was a sweet cake, that the pastils were full of rich wine, that on one flower history was written, on another geography or tables, so those who wished to learn their lessons had only to eat some of the cakes, and the more they ate, the more history, geography, or tables they knew. He believed it all then, but as he grew older, and learned more and more, he became wise enough to understand that the splendor of the Garden of Paradise must be very different to all this. Oh, why did Eve pluck the fruit from the tree of knowledge? Why did Adam eat the forbidden fruit? Thought the king's son, if I had been there it would never have happened, and there would have been no sin in the world. The Garden of Paradise occupied all his thoughts till he reached his 17th year. One day he was walking alone in the wood, which was his greatest pleasure, when evening came on. The clouds gathered, and the rain poured down as if the sky had been a waterspout, and it was as dark as the bottom of a well at midnight. Sometimes he slipped over the smooth grass, or fell over stones that projected out of the rocky ground. Everything was dripping with moisture, and the poor prince had not a dry thread about him. He was obliged at last to climb over great blocks of stone, with water spurting from a thick moss. He began to feel quite faint, when he heard a most singular rushing noise, and saw before him a large cave, from which came a blaze of light. In the middle of the cave an immense fire was burning, and a noble stag, with its branching horns, was placed on a spit between the trunks of 2 pine trees. It was turning slowly before the fire, and an elderly woman, as large and strong as if she had been a man in disguise, sat by, throwing one piece of wood after another into the flames. "Come in," she said to the prince, "sit down by the fire and dry yourself." "There is a great draught here," said the prince, as he seated himself on the ground. "It will be worse when my sons come home," replied the woman. "You are now in the cavern of the winds, and my sons are the 4 winds of heaven. Can you understand that?" "Where are your sons?" asked the prince. "It is difficult to answer stupid questions," said the woman. "My sons have plenty of business on hand. They are playing at shuttlecock with the clouds up yonder in the king's hall," and she pointed upwards. "Oh, indeed," said the prince, "but you speak more roughly and harshly and are not so gentle as the women I am used to." "Yes, that is because they have nothing else to do, but I am obliged to be harsh, to keep my boys in order, and I can do it, although they are so headstrong. Do you see those 4 sacks hanging on the wall? Well, they are just as much afraid of those sacks, as you used to be of the rat behind the looking-glass. I can bend the boys together, and put them in the sacks without any resistance on their parts. I can tell you that they stay, and dare not attempt to come out until I allow them to do so. And here comes one of them." It was the north wind who came in, bringing with him a cold, piercing blast. Large hailstones rattled on the floor, and snowflakes were scattered around in all directions. He wore a bearskin dress and cloak. His sealskin cap was drawn over his ears, long icicles hung from his beard, and one hailstone after another rolled from the collar of his jacket. "Don't go too near the fire," said the prince, "or your hands and face will be frostbitten." "Frostbitten," said the north wind, with a loud laugh. "Why, frost is my greatest delight. What sort of a little snip are you, and how did you find your way to the cavern of the winds?" "He is my guest," said the old woman, "and if you are not satisfied with that explanation you can go into the sack. Do you understand me?" That settled the matter. So the north wind began to relate his adventures, whence he came, and where he had been for a whole month. "I come from the polar seas," he said. "I have been on the Bear's Island with the Russian walrus hunters. I sat and slept at the helm of their ship, as they sailed away from North Cape. Sometimes when I woke, the storm birds would fly about my legs. They're curious birds, they give one flap with their wings, and then on their outstretched pinions soar far away." "Don't make such a long story of it," said the mother of the winds. "What sort of a place is Bear's Island?" "A very beautiful place, with a floor for dancing as smooth and flat as a plate. Half-melted snow, partly covered with moss, sharp stones, and skeletons of walruses and polar bears, lie all about, their gigantic limbs in a state of green decay. It would seem as if the sun never shone there. I blew gently, to clear away the mist, and then I saw a little hut, which had been built from the wood of a wreck, and was covered with the skins of the walrus, the fleshy side outwards. It looked green and red, and on the roof sat a growling bear. Then I went to the seashore, to look after birds' nests, and saw the unfledged nestlings opening their mouths and screaming for food. I blew into the 1,000 little throats, and quickly stopped their screaming. Farther on were the walruses with pigs' heads, and teeth a yard long, rolling about like great worms. "You relate your adventures very well, my son," said the mother. "It makes my mouth water to hear you." After that, continued the North Wind, the hunting commenced. The harpoon was flung into the breast of the walrus, so that a smoking stream of blood spurted forth like a fountain, and besprinkled the ice. Then I thought of my own game. I began to blow, and set my own ships, the great icebergs, sailing, so that they might crush the boats. Oh, how the sailors howled and cried out! But I howled louder than they. They were obliged to unload their cargo, and throw their chests and the dead walruses on the ice. Then I sprinkled snow over them, and left them in their crushed boats to drift southward, and to taste salt water. They will never return to Bear's Island. "So you have done mischief," said the mother of the winds. "I shall leave others to tell the good I have done," he replied. "But here comes my brother from the west. I like him best of all, for he has the smell of the sea about him, and brings in a cold, fresh air as he enters." "Is that the little Zephyr?" asked the prince. "Yes, it is the little Zephyr," said the old woman, "but he is not little now. In years gone by he was a beautiful boy. Now that is all past. He came in, looking like a wild man, and he wore a slouched hat to protect his head from injury. In his hand he carried a club, cut from a mahogany tree in the American forests, not a trifle to carry." "Whence do you come?" asked the mother. "I come from the wilds of the forests, where the thorny brambles form thick hedges between the trees, where the water snake lies in the wet grass, and mankind seem to be unknown." "What were you doing there?" "I looked into the deep river, and saw it rushing down from the rocks. The water drops mounted to the clouds and glittered in the rainbow. I saw the wild buffalo swimming in the river, but the strong tide carried him away amidst a flock of wild ducks, which flew into the air as the waters dashed onwards, leaving the buffalo to be hurled over the waterfall. This pleased me, so I raised a storm, which rooted up old trees, and sent them floating down the river." "And what else have you done?" asked the old woman. "I have rushed wildly across the savannas. I have stroked the wild horses, and shaken the cocoa nuts from the trees. Yes, I have many stories to relate, but I need not tell everything I know. You know it all very well, don't you, old lady?" And he kissed his mother so roughly, that she nearly fell backwards. Oh, he was, indeed, a wild fellow. Now in came the south wind, with a turban and a flowing Bedouin cloak. "How cold it is here," said he, throwing more wood on the fire. "It is easy to feel that the north wind has arrived here before me." "Why, it is hot enough here to roast a bear," said the north wind. "You are a bear yourself," said the other. "Do you want to be put in the sack, both of you?" said the old woman. "Sit down, now, on that stone, yonder, and tell me where you have been." "In Africa, mother. I went out with the Hottentots, who were lion hunting in the Kaffir land, where the plains are covered with grass the color of a green olive, and here I ran races with the ostrich, but I soon outstripped him in swiftness. At last I came to the desert, in which lie the golden sands, looking like the bottom of the sea. Here I met a caravan, and the travelers had just killed their last camel, to obtain water. There was very little for them, and they continued their painful journey beneath the burning sun, and over the hot sands, which stretched before them a vast, boundless desert. Then I rolled myself in the loose sand, and whirled it in burning columns over their heads. The dromedaries stood still in terror, while the merchants drew their kaftans over their heads, and threw themselves on the ground before me, as they do before Allah, their God. Then I buried them beneath a pyramid of sand, which covers them all. When I blow that away on my next visit, the sun will bleach their bones, and travelers will see that others have been there before them. Otherwise, in such a wild desert, they might not believe it possible. So you have done nothing but evil," said the mother. "Into the sack with you," and, before he was aware, she had seized the south wind round the body, and popped him into the bag. He rolled about on the floor, till she set herself upon him to keep him still. "These boys of yours are very lively," said the prince. "Yes," she replied, "but I know how to correct them, when necessary, and here comes the fourth." In came the east wind, dressed like a Chinese. "Oh, you come from that quarter, do you?" said she. "I thought you had been to the Garden of Paradise." "I am going there tomorrow," he replied. "I have not been there for 100 years. I have just come from China, where I danced round the porcelain tower till all the bells jingled again." In the streets an official flogging was taking place, and bamboo canes were being broken on the shoulders of men of every high position, from the 1st to the 9th grade. They cried, "Many thanks, my fatherly benefactor," but I am sure the words did not come from their hearts, so I rang the bells till they sounded, ding, ding dong. "You are a wild boy," said the old woman. "It is well for you that you are going tomorrow to the Garden of Paradise. You always get improved in your education there. Drink deeply from the fountain of wisdom while you are there, and bring home a bottleful for me." "That I will," said the east wind, "but why have you put my brother south in a bag? Let him out, for I want him to tell me about the phoenix bird. The princess always wants to hear of this bird when I pay her my visit every 100 years. If you will open the sack, sweetest mother, I will give you 2 pocketfuls of tea, green and fresh as when I gathered it from the spot where it grew." "Well, for the sake of the tea, and because you are my own boy, I will open the bag." She did so, and the south wind crept out, looking quite cast down, because the prince had seen his disgrace. "There is a palm leaf for the princess," he said. "The old phoenix, the only one in the world, gave it to me himself. He has scratched on it with his beak the whole of his history during the 100 years he has lived." She can read how the old phoenix set fire to his own nest, and sat upon it while it was burning, like a Hindu widow. The dry twigs around the nest crackled and smoked till the flames burst forth and consumed the phoenix to ashes. Amidst the fire lay an egg, red hot, which presently burst with a loud report, and out flew a young bird. "He is the only phoenix in the world, and the king over all the other birds. He has bitten a hole in the leaf which I give you, and that is his greeting to the princess. Now let us have something to eat," said the mother of the winds. So they all sat down to feast on the roasted stag, and as the prince sat by the side of the east wind, they soon became good friends. "Pray tell me," said the prince, "who is that princess of whom you have been talking? And where lies the Garden of Paradise?" "Ho! Ho!" said the east wind, "would you like to go there? Well, you can fly off with me tomorrow, but I must tell you one thing: no human being has been there since the time of Adam and Eve. I suppose you have read of them in your Bible." "Of course I have," said the prince. "Well," continued the east wind, "when they were driven out of the Garden of Paradise, it sunk into the earth, but it retained its warm sunshine, its balmy air, and all its splendor. The fairy queen lives there, in the island of happiness, where death never comes, and all is beautiful. I can manage to take you there tomorrow, if you will sit on my back. But now don't talk any more, for I want to go to sleep." And then they all slept. When the prince awoke in the early morning, he was not a little surprised at finding himself high up above the clouds. He was seated on the back of the east wind, who held him faithfully, and they were so high in the air that woods and fields, rivers and lakes, as they lay beneath them, looked like a painted map. "Good morning," said the east wind. "You might have slept on a while, for there is very little to see in the flat country over which we are passing unless you like to count the churches. They look like spots of chalk on a green board." The green board was the name he gave to the green fields and meadows. "It was very rude of me not to say goodbye to your mother and your brothers," said the prince. "They will excuse you, as you were asleep," said the east wind, and then they flew on faster than ever. The leaves and branches of the trees rustled as they passed. When they flew over seas and lakes, the waves rose higher, and the large ships dipped into the water like diving swans. As darkness came on, towards evening, the great towns looked charming. Lights were sparkling, now seen now hidden, just as the sparks go out one after another on a piece of burnt paper. The prince clapped his hands with pleasure, but the east wind advised him not to express his admiration in that manner, or he might fall down, and find himself hanging on a church steeple. The eagle in the dark forests flies swiftly, but faster than he flew the east wind. The Cossack, on his small horse, rides lightly o'er the plains, but lighter still past the prince on the winds of the wind. "There are the Himalayas, the highest mountains in Asia," said the east wind. "We shall soon reach the Garden of Paradise now." Then, they turned southward, and the air became fragrant with the perfume of spices and flowers. Here figs and pomegranates grew wild, and the vines were covered with clusters of blue and purple grapes. Here they both descended to the earth, and stretched themselves on the soft grass, while the flowers bowed to the breath of the wind as if to welcome it. "Are we now in the Garden of Paradise?" asked the prince. "No, indeed," replied the east wind, "but we shall be there very soon. Do you see that wall of rocks, and the cavern beneath it, over which the grapevines hang like a green curtain? Through that cavern we must pass. Wrap your cloak round you, for while the sun scorches you here, a few steps farther it will be icy cold. The bird flying past the entrance to the cavern feels as if one wing were in the region of summer, and the other in the depths of winter." "So this then is the way to the Garden of Paradise?" asked the prince, as they entered the cavern. It was indeed cold, but the cold soon passed, for the east wind spread his wings, and they gleamed like the brightest fire. As they passed on through this wonderful cave, the prince could see great blocks of stone, from which water trickled, hanging over their heads in fantastic shapes. Sometimes it was so narrow that they had to creep on their hands and knees, while at other times it was lofty and wide, like the free air. It had the appearance of a chapel for the dead, with petrified organs and silent pipes. "We seem to be passing through the valley of death to the garden of paradise," said the prince. But the east wind answered not a word, only pointed forwards to a lovely blue light which gleamed in the distance. The blocks of stone assumed a misty appearance, till at last they looked like white clouds in moonlight. The air was fresh and balmy, like a breeze from the mountains perfumed with flowers from a valley of roses. A river, clear as the air itself, sparkled at their feet, while in its clear depths could be seen gold and silver fish sporting in the bright water, and purple eels emitting sparks of fire at every moment, while the broad leaves of the water lilies, that floated on its surface, flickered with all the colors of the rainbow. The flower in its color of flame seemed to receive its nourishment from the water, as a lamp is sustained by oil. A marble bridge, of such exquisite workmanship that it appeared as if formed of lace and pearls, led to the island of happiness, in which bloomed the garden of paradise. The east wind took the prince in his arms, and carried him over, while the flowers and the leaves sang the sweet songs of his childhood in tones so full and soft that no human voice could venture to imitate. Within the garden grew large trees, full of sap, but whether they were palm trees or gigantic water plants, the prince knew not. The climbing plants hung in garlands of green and gold, like the illuminations on the margins of old missals or twined among the initial letters. Birds, flowers, and festoons appeared intermingled in seeming confusion. Close by, on the grass, stood a group of peacocks, with radiant tails outspread to the sun. The prince touched them, and found, to his surprise, that they were not really birds, but the leaves of the burdock tree, which shone with the colors of a peacock's tail. The lion and the tiger, gentle and tame, were springing about like playful cats among the green bushes, whose perfume was like the fragrant blossom of the olive. The plumage of the wood pigeon glistened like pearls as it struck the lion's mane with its wings, while the antelope, usually so shy, stood near, nodding its head as if it wished to join in the frolic. The fairy of paradise next made her appearance. Her raiment shone like the sun, and her serene countenance beamed with happiness like that of a mother rejoicing over her child. She was young and beautiful, and a train of lovely maidens followed her, each wearing a bright star in her hair. The east wind gave her the palm leaf, on which was written the history of the phoenix, and her eyes sparkled with joy. She then took the prince by the hand, and led him into her palace, the walls of which were richly colored, like a tulip leaf when it is turned to the sun. The roof had the appearance of an inverted flower, and the colors grew deeper and brighter to the gazer. The prince walked to a window, and saw what appeared to be the tree of knowledge of good and evil, with Adam and Eve standing by, and the serpent near them. "I thought they were banished from paradise," he said. The princess smiled, and told him that time had engraved each event on a window pane in the form of a picture, but, unlike other pictures, all that it represented lived and moved, the leaves rustled, and the persons went and came, as in a looking-glass. He looked through another pane, and saw the ladder in Jacob's dream, on which the angels were ascending and descending with outspread wings. All that had ever happened in the world here lived and moved on the panes of glass, in pictures such as time alone could produce. The fairy now led the prince into a large, lofty room with transparent walls, through which the light shone. Here were portraits, each one appearing more beautiful than the other, millions of happy beings, whose laughter and song mingled in one sweet melody. Some of these were in such an elevated position that they appeared smaller than the smallest rosebud, or like pencil dots on paper. In the center of the hall stood a tree, with drooping branches, from which hung golden apples, both great and small, looking like oranges amid the green leaves. It was the tree of knowledge of good and evil, from which Adam and Eve had plucked and eaten the forbidden fruit, and from each leaf trickled a bright red dewdrop, as if the tree were weeping tears of blood for their sin. "Let us now take the boat," said the fairy. "A sail on the cool waters will refresh us. But we shall not move from the spot, although the boat may rock on the swelling water, the countries of the world will glide before us, but we shall remain still." It was indeed wonderful to behold. First came the lofty Alps, snow-clad, and covered with clouds and dark pines. The horn resounded, and the shepherds sang merrily in the valleys. The banana trees bent their drooping branches over the boat, black swans floated on the water, and singular animals and flowers appeared on the distant shore. New Holland, the fifth division of the world, now glided by, with mountains in the background, looking blue in the distance. They heard the song of the priests, and saw the wild dance of the savage to the sound of the drums and trumpets of bone. The pyramids of Egypt rising to the clouds, columns and sphinxes, overthrown and buried in the sand, followed in their turn, while the northern lights flashed out over the extinguished volcanoes of the north, in fireworks none could imitate. The prince was delighted, and yet he saw hundreds of other wonderful things more than can be described. "Can I stay here forever?" asked he. "That depends upon yourself," replied the fairy. "If you do not, like Adam, long for what is forbidden, you can remain here always." "I should not touch the fruit on the tree of knowledge," said the prince. "There is abundance of fruit equally beautiful." "Examine your own heart," said the princess, "and if you do not feel sure of its strength, return with the east wind who brought you. He is about to fly back, and will not return here for 100 years. The time will not seem to you more than 100 hours, yet even that is a long time for temptation and resistance. Every evening, when I leave you, I shall be obliged to say, 'Come with me,' and to beckon to you with my hand. But you must not listen, nor move from your place to follow me, for with every step you will find your power to resist weaker. If once you attempted to follow me, you would soon find yourself in the hall, where grows a tree of knowledge, for I sleep beneath its perfumed branches. If you stooped over me, I should be forced to smile. If you then kissed my lips, the garden of paradise would sink into the earth, and to you it would be lost. A keen wind from the desert would howl around you, cold rain fall on your head, and sorrow and woe be your future lot. I will remain," said the prince. So the east wind kissed him on the forehead, and said, "Be firm, then shall we meet again when 100 years have passed. Farewell, farewell." Then the east wind spread his broad pinions, which shone like the lightning in harvest, or as the northern lights in a cold winter. "Farewell, farewell," echoed the trees and the flowers. Storks and pelicans flew after him in feathery bands, to accompany him to the boundaries of the garden. "Now we will commence dancing," said the fairy, "and when it is nearly over at sunset, while I am dancing with you, I shall make a sign, and ask you to follow me, but do not obey. I shall be obliged to repeat the same thing for 100 years, and each time, when the trial is past, if you resist, you will gain strength, till resistance becomes easy, and at last the temptation will be quite overcome. This evening, as it will be the first time, I have warned you." After this the fairy led him into a large hall, filled with transparent lilies. The yellow stamina of each flower formed a tiny golden harp, from which came forth strains of music like the mingled tones of flute and lyre. Beautiful maidens, slender and graceful in form, and robed in transparent gauze, floated through the dance, and sang of the happy life in the garden of paradise, where death never entered, and where all would bloom forever in immortal youth. As the sun went down, the whole heavens became crimson and gold, and tinted the lilies with the hue of roses. Then the beautiful maidens offered to the prince sparkling wine, and when he had drank, he felt happiness greater than he had ever known before. Presently the background of the hall opened and the tree of knowledge appeared, surrounded by a halo of glory that almost blinded him. Voices, soft and lovely as his mother, sounded in his ears, as if she were singing to him, "My child, my beloved child." Then the fairy beckoned to him, and said in sweet accents, "Come with me, come with me." Forgetting his promise, forgetting it even on the very first evening, he rushed towards her, while she continued to beckon to him and to smile. The fragrance around him overpowered his senses, the music from the harps sounded more entrancing, while around the tree appeared millions of smiling faces, nodding and singing. Man should know everything, man is the lord of the earth. The tree of knowledge no longer wept tears of blood, for the dewdrops shone like glittering stars. "Come, come," continued that thrilling voice, and the prince followed the call. At every step his cheeks glowed, and the blood rushed wildly through his veins. "I must follow," he cried. "It is not a sin, it cannot be, to follow beauty and joy. I only want to see her sleep, and nothing will happen unless I kiss her, and that I will not do, for I have strength to resist, and a determined will." The fairy threw off her dazzling attire, bent back the boughs, and in another moment was hidden among them. "I have not sinned yet," said the prince, "and I will not," and then he pushed aside the boughs to follow the princess. She was lying already asleep, beautiful as only a fairy in the garden of paradise could be. She smiled as he bent over her, and he saw tears trembling out of her beautiful eyelashes. "Do you weep for me?" he whispered. "Oh, weep not, thou loveliest of women. Now do I begin to understand the happiness of paradise. I feel it to my inmost soul, in every thought. A new life is born within me. One moment of such happiness is worth an eternity of darkness and woe." He stooped and kissed the tears from her eyes, and touched her lips with his. A clap of thunder, loud and awful, resounded through the trembling air. All around him fell into ruin. The lovely fairy, the beautiful garden, sunk deeper and deeper. The prince saw it sinking down in the dark night till it shone only like a star in the distance beneath him. Then he felt a coldness, like death, creeping over him. His eyes closed, and he became insensible. When he recovered, a chilling rain was beating upon him, and a sharp wind blew on his head. Alas! What have I done? He sighed. I have sinned like Adam, and the garden of paradise has sunk into the earth. He opened his eyes, and saw the star in the distance, but it was the morning star in heaven which glittered in the darkness. Presently he stood up and found himself in the depths of the forest, close to the cavern of the winds, and the mother of the winds sat by his side. She looked angry, and raised her arm in the air as she spoke. "The very first evening," she said. "Well, I expected it. If you are my son, you should go into the sack." "And there he will have to go at last," said a strong old man, with large black wings, and a scythe in his hand, whose name was Death. "He shall be laid in his coffin, but not yet. I will allow him to wander about the world for a while, to atone for his sin, and to give him time to become better. But I shall return when he least expects me. I shall lay him in a black coffin, place it on my head, and fly away with it beyond the stars. There also blooms a garden of paradise, and if he is good and pious he will be admitted, but if his thoughts are bad, and his heart is full of sin, he will sink with his coffin deeper than the garden of paradise has sunk. Once in every 1,000 years I shall go and fetch him, when he will either be condemned to sink still deeper, or be raised to a happier life in the world beyond the stars." Chapter 74. The Pea Blossom. There were once 5 peas in one shell. They were green, the shell was green, and so they believed that the whole world must be green also, which was a very natural conclusion. The shell grew, and the peas grew. They accommodated themselves to their position, and sat all in a row. The sun shone without and warmed the shell, and the rain made it clear and transparent. It was mild and agreeable in broad daylight, and dark at night, as it generally is, and the peas as they sat there grew bigger and bigger, and more thoughtful as they mused, for they felt there must be something else for them to do. "Are we to sit here forever?" asked one. "Shall we not become hard by sitting so long? It seems to me there must be something outside, and I feel sure of it." And as weeks passed by, the peas became yellow, and the shell became yellow. "All the world is turning yellow, I suppose," said they, and perhaps they were right. Suddenly they felt a pull at the shell. It was torn off, and held in human hands, then slipped into the pocket of a jacket in company with other full pods. "Now we shall soon be opened," said one, just what they all wanted. "I should like to know which of us will travel furthest," said the smallest of the 5. "We shall soon see now. What is to happen will happen," said the largest pea. Crack went the shell as it burst, and the 5 peas rolled out into the bright sunshine. That they lay in a child's hand. A little boy was holding them tightly, and said they were fine peas for his pea shooter. And immediately he put one in and shot it out. "Now I am flying out into the wide world," said he. "Catch me if you can," and he was gone in a moment. "I," said the second, "intend to fly straight to the sun. That is a shell that lets itself be seen, and it will suit me exactly," and away he went. "We will go to sleep wherever we find ourselves," said the 2 next. "We shall still be rolling onwards," and they did certainly fall on the floor, and roll about before they got into the pea shooter, but they were put in for all that. "We shall go farther than the others," said they. "What is to happen will happen," exclaimed the last, as he was shot out of the pea shooter, and as he spoke he flew up against an old board under a garret window, and fell into a little crevice, which was almost filled up with moss and soft earth. The moss closed itself round him, and there he lay, a captive indeed, but not unnoticed by God. "What is to happen will happen," said he to himself. Within the little garret lived a poor woman, who went out to clean stoves, chop wood into small pieces and perform such like hard work, for she was strong and industrious. Yet she remained always poor, and at home in the garret lay her only daughter, not quite grown up, and very delicate and weak. For a whole year she had kept her bed, and it seemed as if she could neither live nor die. "She is going to her little sister," said the woman. "I had but the 2 children, and it was not an easy thing to support both of them, but the good God helped me in my work, and took one of them to himself and provided for her. Now I would gladly keep the other that was left to me. But I suppose they are not to be separated, and my sick girl will very soon go to her sister above." But the sick girl still remained where she was. Quietly and patiently she lay all the day long, while her mother was away from home at her work. Spring came, and one morning early the sun shone brightly through the little window, and threw its rays over the floor of the room. Just as the mother was going to her work, the sick girl fixed her gaze on the lowest pane of the window. "Mother," she exclaimed, "what can that little green thing be that peeps in at the window? It is moving in the wind." The mother stepped to the window and half opened it. "Oh," she said, "there is actually a little pea which has taken root and is putting out its green leaves. How could it have got into this crack? Well now, here is a little garden for you to amuse yourself with." So the bed of the sick girl was drawn nearer to the window, that she might see the budding plant, and the mother went out to her work. "Mother, I believe I shall get well," said the sick child in the evening. "The sun has shone in here so brightly and warmly today, and the little pea is thriving so well, I shall get on better, too, and go out into the warm sunshine again." "God grant it," said the mother, but she did not believe it would be so. But she propped up with the little stick the green plant which had given her child such pleasant hopes of life, so that it might not be broken by the winds. She tied the piece of string to the windowsill and to the upper part of the frame, so that the pea tendrils might twine round it when it shot up. And it did shoot up, indeed it might almost be seen to grow from day to day. "Now really here is a flower coming," said the old woman one morning, and now at last she began to encourage the hope that her sick daughter might really recover. She remembered that for some time the child had spoken more cheerfully, and during the last few days had raised herself in bed in the morning to look with sparkling eyes at her little garden which contained only a single pea plant. A week after, the invalid sat up for the first time a whole hour, feeling quite happy by the open window in the warm sunshine, while outside grew the little plant, and on it a pink pea blossom in full bloom. The little maiden bent down and gently kissed the delicate leaves. This day was to her like a festival. "Our Heavenly Father himself has planted that pea, and made it grow and flourish, to bring joy to you and hope to me, my blessed child," said the happy mother, and she smiled at the flower, as if it had been an angel from God. But what became of the other peas? Why, the one who flew out into the wide world, and said, "Catch me if you can," fell into a gutter on the roof of a house, and ended his travels in the crop of a pigeon. The two lazy ones were carried quite as far, for they also were eaten by pigeons, so they were at least of some use. But the fourth, who wanted to reach the sun, fell into a sink and lay there in the dirty water for days and weeks, till he had swelled to a great size. "I am getting beautifully fat," said the pea. "I expect I shall burst at last." No pea could do more than that. "I think I am the most remarkable of all the 5 which were in the shell." And the sink confirmed the opinion. But the younger maiden stood at the open garret windows, with sparkling eyes and the rosy hue of health on her cheeks. She folded her thin hands over the pea blossom, and thanked God for what he had done. "I," said the sink, "shall stand up for my pea." Chapter 75 The Pen and the Inkstand. In a poet's room, where his inkstand stood on the table, the remark was once made, "It is wonderful what can be brought out of an inkstand." What will come next? It is indeed wonderful. "Yes, certainly," said the inkstand to the pen, and to the other articles that stood on the table. "That's what I always say. It is wonderful and extraordinary what a number of things come out of me. It's quite incredible, and I really don't know what is coming next when that man dips his pen into me. One drop out of me is enough for half a page of paper, and what cannot half a page contain? From me, all the works of a poet are produced, all those imaginary characters whom people fancy they have known or met. All the deep feeling, the humor, and the vivid pictures of nature. I myself don't understand how it is, for I am not acquainted with nature, but it is certainly in me. From me have gone forth to the world those wonderful descriptions of troops of charming maidens, and of brave knights on prancing steeds, of the halt and the blind, and I know not what more, for I assure you I never think of these things." "You are right," said the pen, "for you don't think at all. If you did, you would see that you can only provide the means. You give the fluid that I may place upon the paper what dwells in me, and what I wish to bring to light. It is the pen that writes, no man doubts that, and, indeed, most people understand as much about poetry as an old inkstand." "You have had very little experience," replied the inkstand. "You have hardly been in service a week, and are already half worn out. Do you imagine you are a poet? You are only a servant, and before you came I had many like you, some of the goose family, and others of English manufacture. I know a quill pen as well as I know a steel one. I have had both sorts in my service, and I shall have many more when he comes, the man who performs the mechanical part and writes down what he obtains from me. I should like to know what will be the next thing he gets out of me." "Inkpot!" exclaimed the pen contemptuously. Late in the evening the poet came home. He had been to a concert, and had been quite enchanted with the admirable performance of a famous violin player whom he had heard there. The performer had produced from his instrument a richness of tone that sometimes sounded like tinkling water drops or rolling pearls, sometimes like the birds twittering in chorus, and then rising and swelling in sound like the wind through the fir trees. The poet felt as if his own heart were weeping, but in tones of melody like the sound of a woman's voice. It seemed not only the strings, but every part of the instrument from which these sounds were produced. It was a wonderful performance and a difficult piece, and yet the bow seemed to glide across the strings so easily that it was as if anyone could do it who tried. Even their violin and the bow appeared to perform independently of their master who guided them. It was as if soul and spirit had been breathed into the instrument, so the audience forgot the performer in the beautiful sounds he produced. Not so the poet. He remembered him, and named him, and wrote down his thoughts on the subject. How foolish it would be for the violin and the bow to boast of their performance, and yet we men often commit that folly. The poet, the artist, the man of science in his laboratory, the general comma, we all do it, and yet we are only the instruments which the Almighty uses. To him alone the honor is due. We have nothing of ourselves of which we should be proud. Yes, this is what the poet wrote down. He wrote it in the form of a parable, and called it the master and the instruments. That is what you have got, madame, said the pen to the inkstand, when the two were alone again. Did you hear him read aloud what I had written down? Yes, what I gave you to write, retorted the inkstand. That was a cut at you because of your conceit. To think that you could not understand that you were being quizzed. I gave you a cut from within me. Surely I must know my own satire, ink pitcher, cried the pen. Writing stick, retorted the inkstand. And each of them felt satisfied that he had given a good answer. It is pleasing to be convinced that you have settled a matter by your reply. It is something to make you sleep well, and they both slept well upon it. But the poet did not sleep. Thoughts rose up within him like the tones of the violin, falling like pearls, or rushing like the strong wind through the forest. He understood his own heart in these thoughts. They were as a ray from the mind of the great master of all minds. To him be all the honor,